Right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker. And today, for this week's episode of Real Seeker Ministries, I'm continuing on with my review show of Caleb Jackson's case against the resurrection, whereby he's taking a devil's advocate position. Caleb Jackson is a well-known Christian apologist and friend of mine. And he's written a book supporting the resurrection and proving that it did happen and counts as proof for the truth of Christianity. But he did a 1-hour video where he wanted to, okay, well, let me play the devil's advocate here. Let me put on my little baseball cap and become Caleb the Atheist, the evil skeptic, and adopts their perspective. And he does his best to kind of lay out the case against Jesus rising from the dead, at least to the best of his ability. And I think he gives a substantive case, a good case. He does better than a lot of atheists. Definitely the SNS skeptics, he kicks their rumps. He leaves them in the dust. I mean, they suck with their objections. It's usually the typical tiresome, boring, low-hanging fruit that you get from atheists and skeptics on the internet. Caleb's going, at least for the most part, I think he's going above and beyond. He's providing what the atheists should be trying to argue if they want to come up with something substantive against the resurrection. And he's going for the best case that he can make. So yeah, with that said, I covered in part 1 of this review series, I covered the first 16 minutes of his video, which is on the prior probability factors. So when you're assessing a hypothesis, the resurrection hypothesis in this case, you first look at the prior probability factors that make it intrinsically unlikely to be true, given your background evidence. And Caleb covered at least about 3 main segments or factors there. So number 1 is that it's implausible for there to be anything like a bodily resurrection. That's implausible, and he gave Dale Allison's reasoning about the philosophical issue of identity and how do you continue to be the same thing or same person bodily when your atoms are constantly changing and you decay. Some people, their bodies are entirely gone and destroyed after death. Secondly, he says Jesus was a failure as a Jewish Messiah because he failed to fulfill various messianic prophecies, and I addressed that. And then finally, he says, look, Jesus was a horrible, an immoral teacher and a false prophet. So that makes it unlikely God would want to raise him from the dead bodily. So I addressed those. I'm happy to report that Caleb liked what I provided and thought it was worth something. So I'm thrilled to hear that. I did try my best to give him something there. So now I want to continue on. Now we're looking at the next aspects of his resurrection, case against the resurrection, the historical evidence, and also looking at the explanatory power and that sort of thing at the end. So let's start with the historical evidence. Let's hear what Caleb has to say.
Let's look, putting that aside, putting that into our perspective and to compartmentalize that, let's look at the historical evidence now. What is the actual evidence we're looking for the resurrection of Jesus? Well, first of all, the empty tomb apologists will point out a lot, and there's a lot of discussion on this anyway, but one important thing with the empty tomb that one should be mentioned, let me grant for the sake of argument that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. I don't think that the argument that he would be left on a cross or rod is very good, and most scholars don't agree with that. So we can grant that Jesus was probably buried in a known tomb somewhere, but even granting this for the sake of argument wouldn't necessarily help us. There's plenty of stories in ancient Judea, and not just Judea, but in Greece and antiquity of vanishing bodies. And I have just a list here for people to go and look up if they want. This includes people like Heracles, Chaereas, and Killerhoe, Aeneas, and even some later Christian legends all have stories about bodies going missing. The person comes to where the person is buried, but they can't find the body, and the body's been taken up into heaven. And there's quite a few scholarly articles and writings on this to support this thesis. And so while this doesn't prove that the story of the empty tomb is false, that's in Mark and the other Gospels, it certainly makes us suspicious knowing that we know this is a literary motif in a lot of other places. And so one would have to have really good evidence to think that this isn't that kind of example. To give another example, we could look at Aristeas. Aristeas suddenly dropped down dead. The report of his death had just spread through the town when a certain individual contradicted the rumor, affirming that he had met Aristeas on the road to Cyzicus and had spoken with him. They went to retrieve all things necessary for the funeral, intending to carry the body away. But on the being opened, no Aristeas was found, either dead or alive. 7 years afterwards, he reappeared, they told me, and Proconeus, where afterwards he disappeared a second time. And that's according to the Greek historian Herodotus. And he's hearing the story, I think, second or third hand. But the point is, we have lots of stories about people dying, the bodies going missing, and them appearing to people later on in a glorified state, including, it's interesting that this one mentions a road. That does make one think of Luke 24, the road to Emmaus. Whether there's a literary connection here, who knows? But the point is that this is not necessarily a unique story, and that one can find parallels here. So if one wants to phrase this as an argument, we can say that stories of missing bodies in antiquity are most likely fiction. Premise 2, the empty tomb narrative in the Gospels is a missing body story from antiquity. Premise 3, therefore, the empty tomb narrative in the Gospels is most likely fictional. Now, again, it is possible that the Gospels could be the exception to this rule, but we would need exceptional evidence for this. And if the evidence is at least equal to these other stories, then we wouldn't have any reason to think that they are probably historical.
Okay, so I want to pause it at this point. So this is his first argument. So it's regarding the historicity of the empty tomb. And again, make a note that Caleb the atheist here is granted it's a historical fact that Jesus was in fact buried in a known empty tomb, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. So that's half the battle right there. But he says, look, even granting this, I'm not going to take the typical fundile atheist and skeptic nonsense that people like Bart Ehrman go for, saying they probably threw him in a common pit because that's what they did with most criminals. There's enough proof and evidence to say that's not true in Jerusalem with Jews. The Romans didn't do that and stuff like that. So he's kind of just granting that Jesus did have a burial in a known tomb, and that was the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Great. But even still, that doesn't mean you can prove that the tomb was found empty afterwards. And his first argument here, I have to confess, I'm not that impressed with. I don't think it speaks one way or the other. It just doesn't make an impact. And here's why, right? So, yes, so Caleb mentions, let me just go back, and Caleb mentions all of these various pagan narratives about people vanishing from the tomb. The disciples go look, and then the body is missing. There are obviously the devil's in the details. There are obviously differences between the gospel accounts of what happened to Jesus and his resurrection compared to these other examples. In this case, some guy didn't show up until 7 years afterwards, right? Aristeas didn't show up. And this was told to Proconesus and that sort of thing right there. So obviously there are differences in the specific details, but Caleb's just using this to say, look, the fundamental aspect is that, look, people were buried in tombs, and when their disciples went to show up, they weren't there. And of course, we're assuming these pagan things are totally mythical, they're not real. And at least for his argument to work, he has to assume that most of these aren't historically true stories, but they're fictional myths. Again, no proof is given to do that. I think Caleb the atheist is assuming most Christians will say, yeah, most of this is just complete rubbish. But I would like to say that there are differences in the details. That's important for making this kind of most A's or B's. The resurrection of Jesus, C is an A, or the resurrection story of Jesus is an A, therefore the resurrection of Jesus is also a fictional myth. Well, you have to look at the details of the context and the likelihood of whether or not Jews would borrow from pagan myths and stuff like that. So none of that was provided here. I think that's kind of a hidden assumption. These are kind of the hidden assumptions in Caleb the atheist in the case he's making. But the main point that I just wanted to raise here is that I don't think this argument works. It's a non-cogent argument because it's an inductive argument. Obviously, it only says most stories. So yes, Jesus could be an exception, but I don't think that we can prove most stories from antiquity I don't think that we can prove that this means anything, because these stories, even if they're fictional, are based on reality. We also have absolute historical proof that bodies actually went missing. And in fact, in what Caleb the Atheist is going to play, is going to give actual examples from modern history of bodies going missing. So these are myths for a reason, because they're based on reality, what happens in reality. There are cases in the ancient world of bodies going missing. That's why they had laws making it illegal. Don't do this. Stay away from the dead. Don't touch their bodies. They can't rest. They're going to come back and haunt the living. So this is a well-known phenomenon that occurs in reality, and the myths are simply reflecting those realities. So I think it's 50-50. I don't think you can prove your first premise here, that stories of missing bodies in antiquity are most likely fictional, or that they have to be most likely fictional. Even if all of the pagan myth stories that you refer to are in fact fictional, that doesn't prove anything in terms of Jesus' story meant to be fictional, especially because it's not the same genre as those other texts. How long after the fact were those myths made about these people, whereas the Gospels were made within decades of Jesus? So these are things that make Jesus quite unique and standing out, where he's not comparable to Greek myths or pagan myths at all. No, he was a known historical person within memory of the eyewitnesses themselves, where they're talking about these stories. So that's a total different game changer. And I think because of that, we have to say it's 50-50. We don't know, at least just based off the fact that there are stories in the ancient world. No, well, sure, there are stories that are myths. Those stories reflect historical realities of bodies going missing in real life. Therefore, when it comes to Jesus, which is of the Greco-Roman biography or historiography genre, about a personality who lived just decades before within living eyewitness testimony, eyewitness memory and that sort of thing, it's a totally different story. I think it's just 50-50. You can't decide one way or the other based on the fact that there are made up myths about missing bodies. So yeah, I think that this argument kind of fails.
Equal to these other stories, then we wouldn't have any reason to think that they are probably historical. But let's grant that maybe there is something different. What about the fact that the empty tomb is an earlier tradition, right? That this is something that wasn't written down centuries later, but it's in Mark and
okay, very good. Now he's getting into it.
Perhaps it's implied in Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:4. Regardless, we know that the early Christians proclaimed in Jerusalem, and so people could theoretically go and show the body. Well, this is problematic for a few reasons. Jewish law actually says that you can't identify a body, and 3 days or more after it's been decomposed. Quote, you cannot testify to the identity of a corpse save by the facial features together with the nose. You can testify only within 3 days. So because Jesus was dead, and rose on the third day, and because they didn't even proclaim the resurrection publicly until 40 days later, not only would the body be decomposed, but even if they could somehow identify it, this would not be legal. And so there's no reason to think the Pharisees would try to take this up in a legal court or drag the body through Jerusalem, especially given the extensive cleanliness laws there. So it's unrealistic to think that anyone could just falsify this offhand. And of course, even if
one thing I just want to say about this part. So this part's interesting. I think I, for the most part, agree with it, right? It's absolutely true. The disciples didn't claim the resurrection until 40 days after publicly, which means they wouldn't have sparked any kind of backlash from the Jews. They wouldn't have known to respond to the claim until after 40 days. Here's something I didn't know about this midrash, or if I did, I've forgotten totally about it. So this is interesting that you're not allowed to give formal legal identification of a body after 3 days. Okay, well that's an interesting aspect that might work in favor of the atheist here. One thing I would just say though, as a caveat, is so obviously Caleb the atheist has granted that it is an early tradition. We can prove this empty tomb tradition is very early, and You have people like Dr. William Lane Craig appealing to that back and forth polemic that kind of develops over time and starts really early, right from the beginning. In Matthew, right? Like, oh, the guard at the tomb. Oh, you stole. Well, why isn't there a body in the tomb? Well, the disciples stole the body. Oh, well, there was a guard there or something. So there's this back and forth development. One thing I would just say is we got to be careful about taking these things too strictly. So obviously the Jewish leadership didn't always have, look at the trial of Jesus. That technically violated formal procedures as well, right? Having a trial on the night of the Sabbath and that sort of thing, that wasn't exactly by the book either, at least according to some, or later rabbis and that sort of thing. But so let's picture the situation 40 days after the fact. All of a sudden, the apostles are showing up and they're saying Jesus has risen from the dead, the tomb is empty, all this stuff. And the Jewish leadership, they wouldn't have to proceed a legal, formal identification of the body. It would be enough. They're just responding to Jews and trying to convince the Jewish populace. So it might be enough just to like peek in and say, okay, there is a body or something. And just the fact that there's a body, you don't need to identify it as Jesus. Just the fact that there is a rotting corpse in there at all would be enough to disprove the claims of the early Christians, apostles, and the 12 in the minds of most unbelieving Jews at that time. So I don't think it's quite as straightforward as this, but I do admit that this is a factor to consider as to whether or not the Jewish leadership would even be willing to at least just say, well, we looked and there's at least a body in there. So that's enough to kind of falsify what these people are saying because it should be totally empty. And that kind of addresses what Caleb the Atheist mentions next. I should have let it just play on where he talks about cognitive dissonance. Because again, with this factor, they're trying to convince unbelieving Jews. It's not necessarily, the Jewish leadership isn't trying to convince Peter, no, he didn't rise from the dead. Look, we got a body in the tomb. And Peter's like, oh, no, I don't care. No, I believe he's the Messiah. I'm going to believe no matter what. It's empty. I don't care if you say you saw a body. Cognitive dissonance is totally irrelevant. The Jewish leadership would be just trying to convert unbelieving Jews who would not be experiencing cognitive dissonance. But Caleb hasn't made that point yet, so let's have him say it.
Oh, is that even if they could somehow identify it, this would not be legal, and so there's no reason to think the Pharisees would try to take this up in a legal court or drag the body through Jerusalem, especially given the extensive cleanliness laws there. So it's unrealistic to think that anyone could just falsify this offhand. And of course, even if people did try to falsify this, even if they did somehow break those Jewish laws and try to do this, there would still be issues. We could have cognitive dissonance. It could be the case that Christians saw the body and they simply denied. They say, no, that's not Jesus. That is Satan is just deceiving you and has put a veil over your eyes. Or perhaps the Jews switched the body out. We do see accusations of body theft elsewhere, and so Christians may have come up with stories about that to try to defend it because they were so fervent in believing Jesus was raised from the dead. It was not an empty tomb that caused belief in the resurrection, but it was belief in the resurrection that caused belief in the empty tomb. And any evidence to the contrary was seen as false. Paul even applies this in Galatians 1:8 when he says, even if an angel were to come down and tell you, this is a different gospel, here it is, I'm giving you a different gospel, you shall not believe them. So it seems unlikely that Christians were in a state to be disproved, and we're open to criticism here. In Acts, we don't see hardly any explicit reference to people going to the tomb and checking. So it seems unlikely that this would have really stopped them. And we have examples of this that I've listed, with Sabbatai Sevi. He was a Jewish messianic figure in the 17th century who converted to Islam. And his followers didn't say, oh, he converted to Islam, you're wrong. They said, oh, that's not the real Sabbatai Sevi. He was assumed into heaven, and the one who here is a fake. Christians could say the same about Jesus. In fact, the Gnostic Christians said, Jesus wasn't actually crucified. He only made it appear like he was. And they simply denied it. Rabbi Schneerson, who's pictured there, was a Jewish messianic figure and rabbi who died in the 90s. And even then, his followers visiting his grave and his funeral said, even though I see the body there, I still believe that the rabbi lives on in his heart, and I think he will be resurrected soon. I know it, and he still is the Messiah despite him dying, and you'll all see essentially. And some of them still affirm that 30 years later. So you do have in Jewish context people holding on to these beliefs, really wanting it to be true, and putting aside all evidence to the contrary. And of course, Jehovah's Witnesses, which I mentioned earlier, with the end of the world. So the point is that often fanatical religious groups don't just admit they're wrong and give up. Usually they double down on their false beliefs and try to rationalize any evidence they can through cognitive dissonance. So it's unlikely that producing the body of Jesus would have convinced them that they were wrong. They would have kept believing. And to give a modern example, there's plenty of Elvis sightings. Elvis died in 1977. We know where his body is. His body is displayed publicly. It was buried in Forest Hill Cemetery, but it had to be moved in about a month later just because of privacy concerns. But even though it was moved, and we have pictures of it being moved, you can see in the top right corner there, we also have pictures of the funeral, and we have pictures of the death certificates. Even with all that evidence, people still later on said they still saw Elvis alive, and the body was fake, and that everyone was lying. So we have a case of a body of a very famous person being dug up and moved and buried in a public place where anyone can go check the grave. And yet we still people saying, no, he's not, that's not him. The body, he's still alive. I saw him. That the body there is just is a duplicate or a fake or whatever. So the point is that digging up a body is not always going to disprove people who are fanatically committed to certain beliefs. So we do have this in the modern day where we have really good evidence. We have photographic evidence. Putting this story 2,000 years ago in a literate culture by unknown authors makes this even more troubling to assess. One last thing I'll say on the empty tomb is that even if the skeptic can concede, even if the evidence.
Okay, so he's getting into that second point, more on the explanatory level for this one. But yeah, so again, I just want to reinforce the point that I was making. Caleb, he's absolutely right with this Elvis sighting and stuff, and despite any disanalogies that might be the case, in terms of it's a totally different story when we're talking about religious Jews in the first century Palestine and making a theological claim that would damn them to hell and stuff like that, and everything that's going on. I do think Caleb is correct about this cognitive dissonance point, even referring to the apostles back in the first century, Jerusalem or Palestine, Judea, I should say, context. I think that, yeah, this is perfectly plausible and that sort of thing, but it's missing the point a little bit, right? It's not the claim of the Christian trying to use this lack of the Jewish authorities showing the body as proof that there was an empty tomb. It isn't, we don't really care about, oh, well, if the apostles came out and said, oh, there's an empty tomb, the Jewish leadership wouldn't go, oh yeah, well, we looked and there was a body. They wouldn't be saying this to try and convert Peter. Those guys are too far gone. You need to kill them, beat them, martyr, get rid of those bad guys. They've drunk the Kool-Aid, so to speak. It would be more about converting unbelieving Jews and preventing them from being suckered in, because thousands of people are converting, if you believe Acts of the Apostles, or lots of people, at the very least, if you want to be a skeptic, lots of people are converting and they're believing this. From your perspective as Caiaphas, the high priest, this BS from these upstart Galilean preachers talking about a resurrection. No, you would go, well, no, we've checked the body, and maybe, oh, there's a legal rule that says we're not allowed to. Okay, well, we didn't check it, but somebody told us, that these guys were corrupt hypocrites. They could come up with some story or something, maybe pay a baker off to say, I was walking by and I happened to peek in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, and there was a body sitting in there. Who cares? I didn't identify him with the face or anything to be Jesus, but obviously there's a body in there. So that, who else could that be in an empty tomb? That would be Jesus. The apostles are claiming that there's no body in that tomb, yet there's a body. That's enough for the unbelieving masses of the unbelieving Jews to just dismiss these Christians. So it should, I think the argument would be, it should still show up in this alternating, developing tradition that we have, this back and forth in Matthew. Let me just pull that up so you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so here's Dr. William Lane Craig talking about this early polemic evidence for the empty tomb.
And the Gospels faithfully record this fact. One final piece of evidence that might be mentioned would be the fact that the earliest Jewish polemic or anti-Christian propaganda itself presupposes the empty tomb. The earliest Jewish polemic that was launched against the Christian proclamation, "He is risen from the dead," was to state that the disciples came by night and stole away his body. And then the Christians responded to that there was a guard at the tomb and they would have prevented the theft and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing in this dispute is not the historicity of the presence of the guard. Rather, the interesting thing is what the Jewish polemic was saying in response to the Christian proclamation, "He is risen from the dead." Were they saying, these men are drunk with new wine, or his tomb is still out there on the hillside? No, they were saying the disciples came and stole away his body. Now think about that for a minute. What that implies is that the body was missing. The earliest Jewish polemic was itself an attempt to explain away the empty tomb. And thus we have evidence for the empty tomb, which comes not from the Christians, but from the very enemies of the earliest Christians themselves, which is historical evidence of first-rate quality, because it comes not from the sources which believed in the resurrection, but from those which disputed it.
All right, so I think you get the point there, right? So look, this is evidence, principle of enemy attestation here for criteria of authenticity and historicity, in historiography, sorry, that we have the fact that the earliest polemic from the Jews is, well, you stole the body, implying, yep, we agree with you, the tomb is empty. Now, again, the Jewish leadership doesn't care about converting the Christians and waking them up from their perspective delusions about Jesus' resurrection. It's a battle between the Christians and the Jewish leadership over the souls of the unbelieving populace of the Jews to prevent them from going astray and joining the Christians. And the Jewish leadership is, if they were just coming up with stuff, if there was no empty tomb, they would have come up with some way, a corrupt way of having a beggar or a necromancer or paying someone off saying, well, I walked by the tomb and I saw a body in there. It must have been Jesus. It was probably Jesus. And the response would be that, but there's a body in the tomb. And that would instantly refute, at least to the minds of the masses, what the Christians were saying. They didn't say that. Instead, they knew there was no body in there, so they had to respond with, well, that's because you stole a body. So that's the point of this, right? It's not about cognitive dissonance is just totally irrelevant to this point, because we're not talking about trying to convince the early Christians. It's a battle over trying to convince or not, or to prevent from being convinced the Jewish masses that are just hearing about this or whatever from the apostles. Jesus rose from the dead. What? The tomb is empty. Oh, okay. But I heard good old Caiaphas said that's because you stole the body. So I don't believe you. What do you say to that? And well, I saw him, and this back and forth. Or sorry, well, what they actually said in Matthew. Well, we couldn't have stolen him. Why? Because there was a guard at the tomb, and it goes back and forth like that. So that's the only bit of advice I have on this. So yeah, let's have Caleb move on with his next point about the empty tomb.
Unknown authors makes this even more troubling to assess. One last thing I'll say on the empty tomb is that even if the skeptic can concede, even if the evidence did point to the tomb actually being empty, that wouldn't necessarily follow that the resurrection is the best explanation. There are modern examples of this happening, and which we are left with a question mark. So, for example, Julie Mott, very sad story. She died in August of 2015. And her funeral service was attended by her family and friends. But a few hours later, when the funeral home workers went to get the body to the cemetery, the body was gone. The grave had been broken. The casket, had been broken into. The picture below is not actually from that event, but the picture above is of Julie. The casket had been broken into, and the body was gone. And although there were security cameras there, they did not capture anything. In particular, even though the doors had been locked, to stop anyone outside of the service from getting the body. it still managed to go away. And so this happened 7 years ago. We still don't have an explanation. There are suspects. Some people think that Julie's ex-boyfriend might have taken the body because he lingered a little bit after the service and was acting suspicious, but he's never been formally convicted because there's simply no hard evidence to prove that he actually did. And a few months prior to this, the funeral home directors had misplaced another body and were sued for it. But again, there's no evidence that they did this in this case. And so we have to say that we don't really know what the explanation is. But although we can't prove either of those two other hypotheses, it wouldn't be a good explanation to conclude that perhaps Julie did, in fact, rise from the dead and get out the coffin herself and walked away. That would be astronomically improbable. And although we can't prove the other hypotheses, we can't prove that the body was stolen or misplaced, it's still rational to think that's a more likely option given what we know, because we can't prove it or disprove it either way. And so given this can happen in the modern day with security cameras where there were people, essentially guarding the body with the security aspects they had and locked doors, it's not unthinkable that bodies could be misplaced back then or something could happen to it. We have to say we don't know what happened to it, but we do know that on rare occasions bodies do go missing for a variety of reasons. And so even if that's granted, we can say that perhaps the body went missing for whatever reason. So it doesn't follow that it's necessarily good evidence for the resurrection.
Okay, so before he moves on to that, just back up. Okay, so Caleb with this slide essentially shifts gears here. So he's no longer talking about the historical fact. Now with this slide, let me just, for the sake of argument, grant you that the empty tomb is a historical fact on an explanatory level now. So we've established the facts, but how do we explain that? Does that prove that the resurrection hypothesis is more probably true than not? That God raised Jesus from the dead, given he had a motivating reason to do so, raised him bodily. Sorry, I forgot the modification in the hypothesis. Well, I think that Caleb does a great job here in rebutting this and providing this modern day example. And we know for a fact, in the ancient worlds, it was the same thing. In fact, probably even easier to steal bodies from tombs. There was necromancers going around. Dale Allison talks about that. If you remember my Jesus Mythicism Refuted part 4, I believe it is, where I go over the archaeological evidences. I argue that the Nazareth inscription is proof on a balance of probabilities. It's referring to Jesus's empty tomb, and a response to that saying it's outlawed because this was a common crime that happened quite a bit in the ancient world. It wasn't a rare phenomenon. It was more common than it is today, definitely, that bodies would be stolen by someone from the tomb. So just a couple things to say here. So number one, I think that there is something here that Caleb misses. So there is more that we can glean in terms of the historical, or in terms of the explanations. We can rule out certain explanations, I think. So this incorporates other facts, but I think for example, we can definitely rule out it was not the disciples who stole Jesus' body. That would make them liars and purposeful deceivers. We can rule that out for reasons that we'll get to later in the video, like they wouldn't die for a lie, or they wouldn't be willing to die for a lie, as Gary Habermas puts it, or suffer for these beliefs if they knew it was all a crock. They took the body and it's still rotting in the ground. Secondly, though, I think we can also glean that whoever it was took the body. Look, they took the body within 3 days, just like Jesus predicted. I think it's historical background knowledge we can prove, and possibly Caleb does this in his positive. He'll do this in his positive case for the resurrection. I don't know. We can prove Jesus prophesied he would rise from the dead 3 days after he was killed. And again, the 3 days just means within any time on the third day. It doesn't have to be 72 hours precisely in the ancient Jewish understanding of that idiom. Okay, and guess what? On the quote unquote, the third day, Jesus' body happened to be missing. That's too coincidental. So I think that rules out certain people who would have stolen the body. It would not be someone random who didn't hear him prophesying. It would have to be someone who is familiar with Jesus prophesying that he would raise from the dead on the third day, or be vindicated on the third day, implying resurrection. it would probably not be a necromancer or something like that. Again, too coincidental. And even if a necromancer heard Jesus predicting, again, you have to postulate, and then he used this prophecy as a, oh, this will be a convenient time. I might as well wait. I don't know. That seems a little ad hoc to me. I don't think that he would wait till the third day to steal it, or feel this obligation to steal Jesus' body just to be consistent with his prophecy. So I think it would have to be someone who was a disciple or follower of Jesus. He was pro-Jesus, or these people would have been pro-Jesus, but they wouldn't have been associated with the main 12. Because obviously once they heard the 12 going on about the resurrection, they would have said, oh, no, we took the body. We were trying to honor our master and stuff. You got it wrong. He didn't. We've got it. It's buried over here. So I think that if you're going to go with the stolen body hypothesis, I agree that that's an equally probable explanation for the empty tomb in explanatory isolation. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment when we get to the appearances. However, I do think that we can at least rule out certain people as the likely culprit, right? Just in the same way as Caleb's trying to say, well, it was probably the boyfriend because he was hanging around and stuff like that. Well, in this case, we can falsify. It wouldn't have been the 12 or anyone closely associated with them, like the women or something like that, who would have told them once they realized, oh, they're getting the wrong opinion here. And it would also have to be someone who heard Jesus predicting he would be raised from the dead within 3 days, and they purposefully took the body in coincidence, corresponding to that prophecy, purposefully. So yeah, it does put a bit of a strain on the naturalistic interpretation, I think, but I would still say it's an equally probable explanation for the empty tomb in explanatory isolation. Now, one thing here that I disagree with Caleb the atheist, rather remarkably, he tries to make this frequentist argument that I think is quite foolish, where he just says, well, look, with Julie, a random peep whose body goes missing, it is more likely than not, more probable than not, there's a low prior probability that she rose from the dead. And on that case, yeah, because she's a random peep. She's in a different reference class from Jesus, right? She's not in the reference class whereby it's likely God had a motivating reason to raise Jesus from the dead, or at the very least equally probable that God would have had a motivating reason, in Jesus' case for religious reasons, to raise Jesus from the dead. Julia Mott's just a random peep. She's not a religious leader. She doesn't claim to prophesy a resurrection. She doesn't claim to be a prophet of God or revealing God's religious message on to mankind, and would be authenticated through an act, a miraculous act like God raising her from the dead. So yeah, obviously the probability on a frequentist sense for Julie Mott's raising from the dead is low, and we would say, yeah, her body was very probably stolen by someone, maybe the boyfriend, maybe someone. In Jesus' case, you don't have the right to say that. He's in a different, what statisticians call reference class. He's within the class of religious heroes or something, whereby God could have had a motivating reason theologically to raise him from the dead. That means it's still 50-50. You can't say it's unlikely that God would have a motivating reason to raise Jesus from the dead. And based on the empty tomb in explanatory isolation, we just have to say we don't know. Maybe God did raise him, maybe God didn't, maybe the body was stolen. That's at best. It's 50-50 at best. There's no reason to say it's more probable than not that someone stole his body, at least not based on a frequentist type argument like what Caleb the atheist gives with the random, non-religiously relevant peep, Julie Mott's, whereby that frequentist argument applies to Julie. It does not apply to the reference class that Jesus was a part of. So that's it in terms of the empty tomb.
Right. Let's look at the appearances of Jesus now. So Paul is our earliest witness on this. If we look at 1 Corinthians 15, and although Paul does not go into descriptions of the appearances, he says who saw Jesus. He lists the appearances. That's about it. He doesn't say what they were like. He does drop a few hints that imply that these could be somewhat visionary in those aspects. So Paul talks elsewhere about Christians having visions, whether in the body or in the mind, he doesn't know, when he goes up to heaven. So Paul was frequently having these experiences. Paul says that Jesus is inside of him. He revealed his son in me, that he continues to live in his heart. And Acts 26 explicitly says that this was a vision on the road to Damascus. And Acts describes this as a light that Paul saw and became blind to. So all these little hints implied that what Paul saw may have been some kind of heavenly vision, which we would attribute to hallucinations. And there have been some psychologists who argued that Paul could potentially have had epilepsy. We can't prove or disprove that, but it's not completely unthinkable given that. And so since Paul equates his appearance with the resurrection appearances of the other 12, and that's the earliest account we have, it's not improbable to think that these could have been of the same nature, that when Paul says, I saw Jesus and so did Peter and the 12, that all of them had this heavenly experience of Jesus, and that only later on was this fleshed out, pun intended, in the Gospels. Now, as far as why would Paul have a hallucination? Wasn't he a skeptic? Well, that's true, but there are cases of people converting for strange reasons, although it is fairly rare. Again, it's not unthinkable. And I've got this screenshot from James Fedor's website, if you want to go check that out, on his article on the resurrection. And he gives a list here of hostile people who were very much against a particular religion who ended up converting for a variety of reasons. And so people like Gerd Ludemann have suggested that Paul may have had a guilt complex. Perhaps Paul felt guilty about the stoning of Stephen or persecuting Christians, and that's what opened him up to have these experiences. Again, we can't prove or disprove that because we have so little information about this historically, but it's not improbable, and we do have other examples of this, so it's not hard to draw analogies here. All right, what do we do with the gospel appearances where Jesus is allegedly appearing to groups of people and eating and talking, and it seems very contrary to what Paul has in mind? Well, we have to. What's interesting to note is that the Gospels, at least in this regard, and other places, seem to chronologically get more and more embellished and more elaborate as time goes on, right? And so this is important because apologists will want to say that, well, the Gospels are very reliable, and so if they tell us they saw this and they were sincere, then we should believe that they saw this, right? That we can trust them because they get other details right. This allows us with epistemic routing to be justified in the other details they get right. So, but that works the other way around. If we have good reasons from our background knowledge, I think the Gospels have a habit of either exaggerating or inventing the details and elaborating all this stuff. That hurts our confidence that when they tell us really extraordinary details, like a dead man talking to them, that we should believe them. We should be even more skeptical. So, and other examples of this, in Mark, Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist, but as the Gospels get later and later with Matthew, Luke, and John, we see John goes out of his way to say, no, Jesus, you should be the one baptizing me. I'm not worthy. And a lot of scholars think this is because there were competing sects between John and Jesus as far as who was the Messiah. And so the Christians wanted to make sure that John's followers knew that John was submitting to Jesus and that Jesus would never be baptized because he was inferior to John. We see this as well with Jesus having the messianic secret in Mark, tell no one, don't let them know I'm the Messiah, being very subtle. To John, he just flat out says, yep, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of God, very explicit with it, to the point where the Pharisees went to stone him. And it's a very big shift of tone. In the Gospels, we have Pilate gets more and more innocent. So in Mark, he seems like, okay, yeah, what did Jesus do? And doesn't have that many qualms about punishing him. Whereas by the time I get to, Matthew, his wife's like, no, Pilate, I had a dream. And this man's innocent, please don't kill him. And Luke, he's like, well, no, I want to have Herod to make sure this man's innocent first. And the Jews really had to twist his arm to get him to do this. And in John, he hands Jesus over to the Pharisees and says, you can crucify him. He hands them over to them. And so Pilate gets more and more absolved from this. And of course, in Matthew, he literally washes his hands and says, I'm not guilty of this man. And so the Christians are shifting the blame from the Romans to the Jews as time goes on in this anti-Semitic kind of trend. And another example is that the burial of Jesus becomes more honorable over time. In Mark, he's buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. He's wrapped up, that's about it. Whereas Matthew, Luke, and John, in Matthew, it's his own family tomb, and it's by himself, and it's a very nice, rich person's tomb. And in Luke and John, he's buried by Nicodemus, and they get perfumes, they get spices, and it's a very expensive and very royal burial for a condemned criminal. And so we see this elaboration as well. So if the Gospels are willing to do this with other details for apologetic reasons, why not be so much more suspicious when the details in the Gospels on the resurrection also seem to follow a similar trend? For example, again, when Paul gives us the description of the resurrection, he's very vague, doesn't give us details, just says, I saw Jesus, and implies these could perhaps be visionary. In Mark, we don't get any narrated appearances. We only get the angel saying, yeah, Jesus will appear to Peter, but we don't know what that's going to look like, what the nature of that was. In Matthew, we do get a very brief appearance to the women on their way back, and he says, go tell the disciples. And the disciples see Jesus on a hill, in a very mountainous region. It's implied that this is like from a distance, a very wide, large area, and the disciples have lots of doubts. It says some doubted, and then it moves on. It doesn't try to resolve the doubts. For all Matthew knows, they could still be doubting to this day. In Luke, we have, angels there, but now the grave clothes are unwrapped so the body wasn't just stolen, because who would unwrap a body? Same with Matthew, because Matthew also had the guards at the tomb to prevent theft. So we see that the accusation of theft trying to be countered by either the guards or the grave clothes being there. And at this time, the appearance of the disciples happens in an enclosed room, so not from a distance like in Matthew. And it also happens where the doubts are resolved. So in Matthew, they doubt. In Luke, they doubt, but Jesus says, oh, but I can eat and touch me. Now you don't have to doubt. Now they believe. John does a very similar thing with the grave clothes. Again, the grave clothes are neatly folded. Jesus appears to them, resolves their doubts. Thomas says, no, I won't believe. Jesus appears to Thomas. He touches Jesus. He believes. And so we see this theme of explaining away why the body couldn't be stolen, explaining away why the doubts weren't important, explaining away why Jesus wasn't merely a ghost. And we know from people like Celsus that early Christians were being accused of seeing ghosts. And so these seem like apologetic, legendary exaggerations being added on in the later Gospels that we don't see in our earlier sources. So given that we know that the Gospels do this in other places, this is the better hypothesis as far as explaining these as legendary and not authentic. But even if we were to take a lot of these passages as written, or at least as some historical core, they're still problematic. As we said, there's a theme of doubt across all of them, and that's really strange. If they're saying Jesus, why are they doubting? And if they saw Jesus and doubted, then how about the people who don't see Jesus and have doubts? How, if the disciples aren't able to overcome this, how else would you be able to, as someone who's not seen the risen Jesus? Another issue is that the appearance is really inconsistent. So sometimes Jesus is recognized, like in Matthew 28, no indication he's not recognized there. But in Luke, they don't recognize on the road to Emmaus, and in John, Mary doesn't recognize him. Originally, she thinks he's the gardener. Sometimes he appears a glorious vision from heaven, like he does with Paul, or the Transfiguration, or in Revelation with John, or when he appears to Stephen in Acts or Ananias. But other times he appears just as kind of a mundane, ordinary guy, like in most of the gospel narratives, where he is mistaken for another person. They don't even notice. Sometimes other people can see him, which is implied in like when Paul sees him on the road to Damascus, or the group appearances in the Gospels. But other times he's only seen by one person, like when Ananias or Stephen see him in a heavenly vision. It doesn't imply that other people there can actually see it. It's all in their head. So we get these very inconsistencies. And if this is some kind of hallucination, we would expect these to be inconsistent, to be contradictory. Whereas if this was all from an objective reference, we'd expect more consistency. And so these inconsistencies are evidence against, partially against the resurrection of Jesus. And to go into this next slide, the appearances usually occur in poor conditions. So to show you what I mean by that, Paul doesn't give a specific description of the appearances, so he's not very helpful there. Matthew mentions a brief appearance to the women, and then the appearance on the mountain is from far away. When Luke has it, Jesus is not recognized by the people on the road to Emmaus at first. And then when he appears to the disciples, it's in very dim lighting and evening, with under candlelight when he's eating with them. And then John has Jesus unrecognized from a far distance away, and he's unrecognized by Mary Magdalene. He appears again at night with the disciples when he eats with them. The appearance to Thomas is very brief and doesn't go into much detail. It just kind of cuts off. And then in John 21, which is the picture there, he's seen from a far distance away to where they don't know it's Jesus at first. So although, there are examples where you could say, well, this is a longer appearance, the point is that a lot of these could be mistaken, could be brief flashing moments of uncertainty. And so when we're looking at memory, we want people to recognize the persons involved. Now, the disciples knew who Jesus was. Cleopas didn't know what Jesus looked like, though. And of course, Jesus is also often unrecognized when he is raised from the dead, which is a strange detail. We want long events that are not overly brief. Most of the resurrection appearances from the Gospels seem to be fairly brief and non-descriptive, with the exception of perhaps John 21 and the appearance of the disciples when they're eating. We want proper vantage and lighting. Again, a lot of these happen where they're either from a far distance or in really dim lighting where details can't be determined. We want normally toned situation. There's no adrenaline, stress, or high intensity. Although that does apply to most of the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb does seem to be a very frantic event that people rushing back and forth and confused and stressed about because they don't know where the body is, and that's distressing. So with certain details on that, one can be suspicious. And we want non-mundane events that are worthy of memory. So something that's not mundane. So admittedly, a resurrection would fall under that. But because the resurrection appearances don't fit all of these criteria, these would probably not be admissible in a court of law today. They would be considered, inapplicable. And it's these kinds of testimonies in bad conditions that get people wrongfully convicted on eyewitness testimony. So all of that needs to be taken into consideration. And so when we ask about what about groups of people, can groups of people have hallucinations? Because if one person saw Jesus, that could be explained. But we can't explain how 12 or more or even 500 saw Jesus. Well, there are group experiences, especially in religious contexts, and group delusions. Marian apparitions, famously Our Lady of Fatima, but you can also look at Medjugorje and some other places where groups of people said they saw the Virgin Mary or some kind of heavenly vision in the sky at the same time. And this is some kind of optical illusion or hallucination or what have you. Same with statues talking, moving. There are stories in ancient Greece about talking statues, and there are actually inscriptions of people saying, we heard the statue talk. We have examples of people seeing statues of the Virgin Mary or Jesus blink or move, and this is seen by groups of people. And usually these have inconsistencies in the stories. Spring Hill Jack, which is pictured in the bottom right corner, was a really interesting kind of example of a mass hysteria in Britain where in the early 1800s, a woman claimed that she was attacked by a man who breathed fire at her and then was able to leap over a fence, hence the name Spring Hill Jack, because he could jump very high. And once this was reported in the newspapers, everyone started seeing Jack. There were witnesses who were in a carriage who saw Jack jump over the roof of a building. There were those saying Jack visited them at night and that he was bringing fire at them. And this got so bad that the mayor of London had to call like a state of emergency. Now, most scholars don't think that Spring Hill Jack actually existed. This was probably some kind of just mass experience. But the point is, these were multiple, polymodal experiences where people said that they could see, hear, and even feel the heat from Jack's breath on them, and this mass sense of panic. And yet this didn't happen. This was all in their head because fear and publicity from these stories. The picture in the bottom left corner is actually a quite funny story from Alabama, of all places, of a group of people claiming to see a leprechaun, and that's the artist's sketch. But you can look it up on YouTube. There's a video of groups of people saying, yeah, we all saw this leprechaun up in a tree, and they seem very adamant about it. So group think and group discussion afterwards can get people to think that they see something that's not there. Same with mass sightings of ghosts, and even group religious experiences in Pentecostal churches where they all feel the Holy Spirit on them at the same time. There's even a pastor who in the 1960s who claimed that Jesus appeared to his whole congregation and walked the aisles. And this was seen by dozens of people in a very strange way. So certainly experiences like this still happen in group settings. And here's an example of Mormonism, of all places, with Joseph Smith, of groups of people being collectively deceived. So this comes from Thomas Ford, who was the former governor of Illinois at the time, who heard this account about Joseph Smith, where he says, Joseph Smith assembled them in a room and produced a box, which he said contained the precious treasure, which was the golden plates. The lid was opened. The witnesses peeped into it, but making no discovery, for the box was empty, they said, Brother Joseph, we do not see the plates. The prophet answered them, O ye of little faith, get down on your knees, brethren, every one of you, and pray to God for the forgiveness of your sins. The disciples dropped to their knees and began to pray in the fervency of their spirit, supplicating God for more than 2 hours with fanatical earnestness. At the end of which time, looking into the box again, they were persuaded they saw the plates. So we have here a group of people, after being suggested by Joseph Smith to pray sincerely for 2 hours, finally say, oh, we can see the plates now. Groups of people are seeing this, not just one person. So one can use the power of suggestion to make people believe this sincerely. All one has to do in this situation is switch out Joseph Smith for Peter and switch out the disciples for the original apostles. And one can imagine Peter saying, I saw Jesus, get on your knees and pray, and you'll see him too. And you get plenty of other stories of people now saying, oh, now I can see Jesus. Oh, now I can feel the Holy Spirit, etc. We don't know that that's how it happened, but according to Paul, we can't rule it out. And bereavement visions of the dead are pretty common, and a lot of scholars have talked about this, so I'll be pretty brief on it. But there are lots of good resources of this, especially Dale Allison's book on the resurrection has lots of examples of people seeing ghosts, and not just individuals, but groups of people. And sometimes they touch with them, sometimes they have conversations with them. Sometimes they don't even know they're dead until they vanish. Pretty much every combination you can think of in the Gospels. One example, and this comes from James Fedore's book, Unreasonable Faith, example of Samuel Bull. Now, Mr. Bull died in 1931. In 1932, his family moved into his house, and they started seeing Samuel's spirit around them. And originally, this was seen by individuals, but as time went on, they started seeing these in group settings where multiple people were in the room and multiple people could see him at the same time. People investigating this case said that all members of the family together saw the apparition. Whenever the apparition was seen, all the persons were able to see it. Mrs. Bull also noted that her deceased husband spoke to her, so we have conversations. He called her Jane. So we have now not only a visual hallucination of the eyes, but also an auditory hallucination, hearing conversations. And he laid his hand on her brow, and that he was solid when they touched him and quite lifelike. So we have seeing, hearing, and now touching in group settings. And this happened multiple occasions. This actually happened over the period of about a month, about 30 days, and then suddenly stopped, which is very reminiscent of excuse me, very reminiscent of Acts, where Jesus appears in them for 40 days and then suddenly stops and then goes up into heaven, supposedly. So it's interesting to draw the analogies here, where we do have examples of groups of people seeing or hallucinating these, things that are not objectively there, where they are inconsistently seeing them and saying they see the same thing, hearing conversations, allegedly touching them. And this shows how much the power of suggestion comes. If you think, oh, I can see him, you can get other people to think they can see him and hear him and all this stuff too. And it's really scary to see what the power of suggestion can do in these situations. The most analogous example I could find is in a Hindu context, an Eastern Asian context, where we have an example of a ghost appearing to people, eating with them and having long conversations. So this comes from the autobiography of a yogi. This was written, I believe, in the 1940s by a known author who is literate, whereas most scholars think the Gospels were written by anonymous authors using stories, second or third hand. So here we have an eyewitness attesting to this allegedly happening. And I won't read all this out, but if you want to pause this and read it, it's basically the story of one of his gurus, one of his yogis, Indian teachers. They're going on a mountainside, and they basically summon his spirit, and his spirit appears to them, and they at first don't believe it's him, but they make a meal together. They sit down and eat with him and touch him, and then after having these conversations, having a meal, he eventually vanishes. And so this is an alleged eyewitness report of this. To my knowledge, I have no reason to think the author doesn't have a good reputation. I have no evidence that he's lying or is dishonest in other places, as far as I'm aware, nor do I know of him having any motive to lie about this. So if it's possible that this was a groupthink hallucinatory situation involving eating, touching, conversing with a dead teacher, it's not hard to think of analogies here, especially since we know this one came from an eyewitness, whereas we don't know that the original gospel authors were eyewitnesses. One final point about the gospel authors and the early Christians being sincere. Often apologists will say, well, all the disciples died, even though some of them will re-note that to say in Sean McDowell's case, Sean McDowell did a book on the martyrdom of the apostles, where we don't actually know that all the apostles died. We know they were at least willing to die, that they proclaimed this and were willing to suffer, but we can only confirm about 4 of them actually did die. But even granting that they were all sincere in their beliefs, that doesn't necessarily prove that they weren't lying. For example, you can die for a known lie if there is an underlying truth behind it. So an example would be lying to Nazis. So if a Nazi comes to your door and says, "Are you hiding Jews?" and you are, even though you are lying to them and you say, "No, I'm not," you're doing this because deep down you really are sincere in the belief that Jews should not be persecuted, that Jews are people with rights, and that I'm very convinced that these rights should be protected. And so if I have to lie to protect these rights, I will do that. And so people have been willing to go to be punished by the Nazis for such lies that they knew were lies, but they did because they had sincere beliefs underpinning them. And so one could say this with the resurrection. Theoretically, we can't prove this in either way, but it's possible that the disciples really believed Jesus was the Messiah, that he had great moral teachings, and that the only way to get people to believe this, because even Paul says that, well, a crucified Messiah, that's foolishness to us and a stumbling block to the Jews, to say, well, Jesus rose from the dead, and so he was the Messiah. The Messiah didn't actually die. God reversed that decision. And so maybe the disciples were willing to lie about this. And They did this because they really did believe Jesus was the Messiah. They really believed they were doing a good thing, and that the only way they could get this message out is by lying. And so even if they didn't believe he was raised from the dead, their sincere belief that professing this would lead to Christianity spreading could be the catalyst. And so people might be willing to die in that case for a quote unquote known lie. We also have the example I put of Jim Jones, which I think is interesting. Jim Jones was a cult leader in the 1970s. I think he ended up having 800 people killed through drinking poison Kool-Aid because they moved to South America. It's a crazy story, but the short version is that he thought he was some kind of prophet and implied that he was God, and that these people believed him, and that he was, speaking God's word essentially, and he was able to deceive all these people. And he would perform faith healings like a psychic surgery, which an example is down there, where he would allegedly take the tumors out of people and say, oh, you've been healed by my power. In reality, he was just using chicken gizzards and tricking people. So the point is, Jim Jones knew that at least part of what he was doing was fake. He knew that the faith healings weren't real, because he can't not know that and also be faking these with chicken gizzards, right? So he would have to know, at least in part, that what he was doing is not legitimate, that he was at least partially a fraud. But perhaps he didn't care. Perhaps he was convinced for other reasons that what he was doing was right to get this group of people together. And he ended up taking them to South America and Guyana, and they all ended up dying, including himself. He could have, said under persecution, well, okay, I made it all up. I'm not really a prophet. I fake my healings, just don't hurt us. But he didn't. He took it to the grave. He stood by what he said. He doubled down, and he ended up taking the poison. And that's kind of the sad thing that happens with people in that state of cognitive dissonance. But this could be a potential example of someone dying for something they know is not true, because they would rather do that than admit they were wrong and take the consequences once they've already gone that far. The last part of this, and
all right, awesome. So that's Caleb's part about the appearances of Jesus. This is my favorite part of the video. This is my favorite part whenever studying the evidence for the resurrection, because for me, what convinces me is the appearances, specifically the appearance to the 12, that I find to be convincing evidence. So, okay, so what do I say by way of assessment of Caleb the Atheist's case against the appearances as evidence for Jesus? So there is just a couple things I want to mention here in terms of general methodology. And this is a bit of a critique. It's both for Caleb the Atheist, but also it's reflecting Christian apologetics as well. So number one, Caleb the Atheist here, he says this section is supposed to be just about the historical evidences or the historical facts. And then the next segment or last section that we're going to get into is where he gets into the criterion of explanatory power and starts evaluating the explanatory hypotheses for their merits or demerits and that sort of thing. But I find he kind of jumbles it up. It's all here in this section, right? So with the empty tomb, he has that last slide talking about, well, and on an explanatory level, maybe the body was stolen or something. So he mixes that up. And I would like it to just be a little bit clearer. I like separating things out a little bit more systematically. So, the way Michael Licona does it. So evaluation of the historical sources that we're using, keep all those considerations for and against in that one section. Then, okay, what does that lead to in terms of the historical facts? It's a fact that there's the empty tomb. Don't worry about explanations or the appearance to the 12, the appearance to Peter, the appearance to Paul. Let's just establish those facts first. Don't worry about explaining them. And then once you've established all the facts and you know what you're looking at, then go to the explanatory hypotheses and do an explanatory assessment, because obviously these facts are interconnected in some cases in terms of certain combination theories, right? So I just don't like the format. It's kind of a mishmash the way Caleb the Atheist has done this. Another thing specifically with the appearances, all of his considerations for all the appearances are there. And that's not just Caleb the Atheist's fault. I mean, Gary Habermas does it, William Craig does it. They like to keep it, David Russell does it. They like to keep this cumulative case argument, which I think is valid. But it almost becomes kind of a mixing up thing when there's no specificity to it. So my approach, I think, is better when I'm handling the resurrection. I literally first I establish the historical facts. That's it in a vacuum. I don't try to explain them. Then when I'm at the explanatory level, so explanatory power, all of that stuff, whatever you're using to assess the explanations, keep that separate from the assessment of what are the facts. And then obviously what the facts are can inform the explanation and stuff like that. But I prefer to, at the explanatory level, take each of the facts and try to explain them. So in the way he did that with the empty tomb, he gave, well, there's an equal ordinary naturalistic explanation in that somebody stole the body, and I qualified, well, it would have to be someone who was a disciple, or at the very least heard and what's even more, understood Jesus' predictions to be raised from the dead or vindicated by God through a resurrection on the third day. So that really limits the amount of suspects, and you can work out, well, is there someone that would be equally probable, likely to steal the body, and who would not be associated with the 12 disciples and inform them and say, whoa, 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 no resurrection. I took the body. That was me. I was trying to honor Jesus, or something like that. So, they never caught up with them. So there's perhaps aspects there. I think it's an equally probable thing. I don't think the empty tomb in explanatory isolation works. But also do that with the appearances. Break up the appearances, right? So assess the individual appearance to Peter, if you think that's a fact, the individual appearance to Paul, the individual appearance to James, the appearance to the 500, the appearance to the 12. I break those up into explanatory isolation, and that just means as much as possible, because, as I said, sometimes at the explanatory level, the explanations of or facts, the historical facts of other appearances plays a role in, it's conducive towards explaining the given appearance, individual appearance or fact that you're trying to explain. So sometimes there's bleed through there, but as much as possible, keep them isolated. Then when you're doing your cumulative case, that's where you're assessing the conjunction. It's a specific thing. So it's the fact that there's an empty tomb and all those factors, and there was an appearance to the 12, and there was an appearance to Peter. So you're not rehearsing the same reasons again, but it's specifically the conjunction, right? And this is what I find Christians don't do when they're doing the cumulative case that I've seen, right? They, or at least not well, in terms of distinguishing the individual assessment of the facts versus the cumulative assessment type deal, and recognizing, look, we're assessing this conjunction. And in my research on the resurrection, I remember going into the fact that certain other facts outside of the fact that I'm looking at in isolation are, when I'm looking at the cumulative case, that conjunction of and the 12 and to Peter and to Paul and to James and an empty tomb, that long conjunction statement there, I recognize that certain facts and or equally probable explanations of those individual facts could be conducive towards a naturalistic explanation for a specific fact or something like that, and conducive towards forming a conjunction. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit. But for just a quick example, obviously, one example would be, okay, well, there is an empty tomb. Great, this caused the women and the people to freak out, like in the Gospels and stuff like that. Maybe Mary and the women saw a gardener or something. They didn't think anything of it at the time. Then Peter had his grief hallucination, let's say. And he reports it to people. Hey, I saw Jesus. He rose from the dead. Yay! Or something like that. And the disciples, they have yet to have their group experience, and or maybe then shortly thereafter, they had a group experience where, hey, I saw him too. Then it started solidifying, and the women went back and went, you know what? I'm going to delude myself. That gardener, that was Jesus. That must have been Jesus. Yeah, we saw him too. Yeah. We saw him first, actually, because he was the gardener. We just didn't recognize him at the time. So, like, you can see how certain facts may or may not be conducive to forming a conjunction and making a combo type theory. And that needs to be assessed when you're doing a cumulative case type argument. And to be honest, with Caleb the Atheist case here, it's all kind of a mishmash. And that's comes because a lot of times Christian apologists try to keep all the appearances, just say the appearances to the disciples, that's the fact, instead of breaking it up individually and systematically going through each individual appearance, assessing those individually, and then at the end, assessing the conjunction of those appearances plus the empty tomb or whatever all the relevant facts are for your resurrection hypothesis at the end of that. So that's kind of my one critique there on that front. The other last methodological critique, and this isn't really an issue for Caleb. Again, he's doing kind of a traditional Bayesian approach, the typical Christian apologist take, where resurrection hypothesis, let's posit how well does the resurrection hypothesis, remember we specified that God would raise Jesus bodily from the dead, given he had motivating reasons to do so. I think minimally that's what Caleb the Atheist has in mind as his hypothesis. You can add on maybe to authenticate the Christian religion or something, but either way, in terms of the restricted hypothesis, I want to highlight that I have a different approach, and this kind of underlines why I think my approach is slightly better than trying to use the resurrection hypothesis. It's the same reason I don't try to argue with the Shroud of Turin for the radiation hypothesis, like other pro-shroud experts do, like Gary Habermas or Bob Rucker. They kind of take the facts and then they say, well, what hypothesis best explains that? Nothing wrong with that. That's a great approach. That's good. But for me, my hypothesis under evaluation when I study the evidences, and this helps me avoid some of the problematic things. Like I don't have to directly care for me, there's only one individual fact that I think proves the resurrection happened. All the others have an equally probable naturalistic explanation for them to my mind. And I'm not sure about the conjunction case, whether there is anything to that or not. But with the appearance to the 12 specifically, I think that proves that the appearance to the 12, that event is a G belief authenticating event, or in other words, a religion authenticating event, an event that God did this event, the Jesus appearance to the 12, for the purpose of authenticating the Christian religion. And that's my hypothesis. It's about the event. It's not, it doesn't even necessarily posit the resurrection. Although obviously in order to be a religion authenticating event, the resurrection would come in with my criteria C, which is the religious context criterion. How does it authenticate the event? Well, it's because it's associated with Jesus. It's an event associated with Jesus's resurrection and serves to attest to that or to authenticate that miracle of God. But it's again, directly, I don't have to argue directly for the resurrection. My thing is just, okay, can I prove that this is a religion authenticating event? Does it fulfill my criteria? And then my hypothesis is that Christianity is true. And then it's presumed because it has these religion authenticating events. So this religion authenticating event would count towards the hypothesis that Christianity is true. And that's independent of negative evidences, such as where Caleb's going to get into stuff about, oh, well, what about other appearances? They're problematic. They didn't recognize Jesus. Maybe these are legends and stuff like that. Well, you're right. And maybe that's relevant to the hypothesis that Christianity is true, because this might show that it's false in some way, right? But at least I don't think it's directly relevant to a resurrection hypothesis per se. Number one, maybe the appearance to the 12 happened, and then, yeah, later Christians made up additional stories. I mean, this happens too. The fact that the appearance to the 500, let's pretend, or the Amos disciples, even Mike Laconis says we can't prove that's historical and stuff like that. So let's pretend that the Amos disciples appearance, that was made up, that's fiction. Well, in terms of a resurrection hypothesis or in my case, assessing whether the appearance to the 12 is a G belief or religion authenticating event, that's totally irrelevant. Who cares what happens to the Amos disciples? I don't need to care about that. It doesn't detract from my evidence. But I would treat that as the Amos disciples issue potentially as a negative evidence if a successful argument, if the Amos appearance to the Amos disciples had to be historical in order for Christianity to be true. You know, you would need to argue for that as an atheist or whatever. Well, sure, then I'll count it as a negative evidence against the is Christianity true hypothesis. But I don't think in itself, again, unless you establish a link, which Caleb hasn't done, why is they're not being recognized by women and possibly people kind of piggybacking on and making up resurrection thing appearances? That doesn't falsify that there were at least one or more real resurrection appearances that supposedly we can prove are in fact miracles or religious authenticating events. So I just wanted to highlight that there's a slight methodological difference, whereas I just assess these events, right? I don't speak of resurrection except within the context of proving the religious context, the authenticating context or the specification criterion. I just proved, look, this event happened. This event it fulfills my criteria for being a religious authenticating event. It's extraordinary, can't be explained by ordinary naturalistic mechanisms on a balanced probabilities, and takes place within a religious authenticating context for Christianity in the form of authenticating Jesus' resurrection. Therefore, Christianity is true. This is a positive factor in favor of the hypothesis Christianity is true. Any other factors, if you want to prove those are negative evidences, great. Put that into Bayes, you'll get the cumulative case. Whereas Caleb and most Christian apologists want to just argue for the resurrection hypothesis almost. And because of that, then they're stuck having to take into effect, okay, the Amos disciples and stuff like that. Well, that detracts from a cumulative case argument for the resurrection hypothesis, or it potentially detracts from the evidence of the appearances you think you can prove, like the appearance to the 12 in my case. That somehow counts against the appearance to the 12. I don't know. Again, I think it's you need more work needs to be done by the atheist to establish that link. I don't see it. I mean, God could have raised Jesus from the dead, and he appeared to the 12. And then 500 people said, hey, we want to be involved. So, oh yeah, he appeared to us one day. And who knows? We get no details of that. So I'm not, and just to be clear, as a Christian, I'm not saying I believe this is what happened. I'm just saying that we don't need to argue for full-fledged Christianity here under Caleb's resurrection hypothesis, right? There could be a resurrection, even if some of the other appearances are problematic or something like that, or we can't prove that they actually happened or that they were miraculous, or even if the atheist is even successful in proving they didn't happen. Like, let's say the Amos disciples thing was a made-up legend that somehow got into the Bible. Potentially that's problematic for Christianity, but it's less clear why is that a problem for this specific resurrection hypothesis that Caleb the atheist has in mind here. You need to establish that link. Again, the only thing I can think of where it is relevant is if you're maybe a factor that would be relevant to a cumulative case type argument, obviously refutes those Amos disciples, or it counts against the appearances to the women potentially and stuff like that, and or applies to a cumulative case argument as a factor, a negative evidence against that being miraculous. But it doesn't necessarily falsify anything to do with the positive evidences from the appearance to the 12 or any of the other facts that successfully prove a miracle took place. I have no idea if that was clear. Okay, whatever, let's move on. Next, he goes into the Apostle Paul. So I'm going to just do a little bit on what I thought of what he said about the Apostle Paul. So yeah, just to a quick clarification before we get into Paul of what I'm trying to say there. So Caleb, we're talking about Caleb the atheist. This is an atheist hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead, given he had a motivating reason to do so. I'm just saying, prior to your Christianity, right? We can't presume, and a lot of atheists always do this. They presume Christian bias that if the resurrection is true, then all of the resurrection stories in the Bible have to be true. It's an all or nothing type deal. And what I'm trying to say here is, without your Christian glasses on, remember, Caleb the atheist has his little atheist ball cap on here. We have to be open to other scenarios, such as positing maybe God really did raise Jesus from the dead, and that's proven by the appearance to the 12 and the appearance to Paul, for example, and the empty tomb. Let's just say those facts prove on a balance of probabilities God raised Jesus bodily from the dead as a miraculous action because he had a motivating reason to do so. And you could still have fake resurrection things, the Emmaus disciples, or the appearance to the woman, that was a delusion, or there's a naturalistic explanation for that. And those resurrection appearances, as narrated in the Bible, are errors. They're wrong. They're mess-ups. Coming with a Caleb the atheist hat, that's a combination theory that you need to be open to, unless you have a reason to prove that it is in fact an all or nothing deal. Obviously, as Christians, we want it to be all or nothing, and so obviously that's what we believe. But you can't have Christian presuppositions as an atheist. Remember, we're critiquing the atheist case, Caleb the atheist case, against the resurrection. Atheists are not allowed to take on Christian presuppositions without proving it. They are making the claim, they bear the burden of proof. They're claiming the resurrection hypothesis, God raising Jesus from the dead, is false because, and if you're pointing to, well, we can prove the Emmaus disciples' appearance didn't happen, or it's problematic because they didn't recognize them, or we can also prove the women didn't happen, they didn't recognize them. Let's just pretend, for the sake of argument here, that argument works. Well, that doesn't necessarily falsify the God raised Jesus from the hypothesis if we have proof on independent grounds, because there could be a combination theory where God did raise Jesus. Perhaps it had nothing to do with authenticating the Christian religion. Again, God has any number of motivating reasons, and maybe he raised him for a different reason than authenticating the Bible or Christianity or something, and he provided the proofs with the appearance to the 12, and then subsequent to that, naturalistically, when people heard the claims, they came up and made up their own resurrection appearances, or they deluded themselves into thinking they had resurrection appearances. Approaching this as an atheist, you have to consider that kind of hybrid, supernatural and naturalistic explanatory hypothesis. You can't just dismiss it. You have to prove, on a balance of probabilities, you have the burden of proof, atheist. You have to prove that combination theory of that type is improbable. You can't just rely on the fact that, well, Christians wouldn't accept a hybrid theory like that, or that would be problematic for Christians who believe in the Bible, right? They believe in the Bible, so they just have to believe that the Emmaus, maybe that's true, but you as the atheist bear the burden of proof. You have to prove with logic. You can't just use the Christians' presuppositions about biblical inerrancy or their beliefs about the resurrection, that all the appearances have to be true or something, to prove your case. Because you have to prove it with logic that's valid for everyone, meaning you have to deal with this hybrid combination theory, whereby maybe a supernatural event, a miraculous event by God did happen, that was attested and proved through various appearances and the empty tomb. But then there are other resurrection appearances associated with that event that are naturalistically explained as fraud or delusion or illusion or some other event. Again, you can't rely on just going, yeah, but the Christians wouldn't accept that. Who cares? This is your claim, atheist. You bear the burden of proof solely, and you have to prove to an agnostic your case. You have to prove to a Muslim your case. You have to prove to every rational agent that your case is true, and that includes maybe a general theist, for example. General theist would believe, oh, I believe God raised Jesus from the dead, but I don't believe that was to authenticate the Christian religion. Pincus Lapide, for example, the general theist wouldn't care about all the Bible stories of the resurrection. They wouldn't care if some of them are false and some of them are true and act as proof that God really did raise Jesus from the dead. So yeah, you as an atheist have to be open to that possibility and provide a critique of that. Why is that? Why would that be improbable theologically speaking or something like that? You can't just say, but the Christians agree with me. The Christians agree that that can't happen. Well, a general theist says, who cares? I don't care what Christians believe or what the Bible says. I believe there's proof that the appearance of the 12 happened and that the appearance of the 12 proves God raised Jesus from the dead on a balance of probabilities. Why should I care about the fact that the Amos disciples came around and made up after the fact and said, oh, I heard Jesus appeared to you. He appeared to us too on the road. See, we're cool. We're in the in club or something. What does that have to do with anything? Yeah, so that my whole point is just I think that kind of thing is being missing, and I would like to see Caleb the Atheist be a little bit more comprehensive rather than relying upon Christian presuppositions in making his case here. And again, that maybe the Christian presuppositions are in fact correct. You can't just, it is an all or nothing type deal. You can't have the Amos disciples or the appearance of the women being fake or naturalistically explained. Maybe that is the case, but again, Caleb the Atheist hasn't made that case. I haven't seen his theological argument or providing a link to establish that that is indeed the only way to go, and that a general theist combination theory is improbable to happen. In other words, it can be true at the same time, it can be true that the Amos disciples is explained naturalistically. It didn't happen. It was a made-up myth, later myth incorporated into the Bible, or it was an illusion or a delusion, some kind of naturalistic explanation for that appearance specifically. And yet, God, it's also true, the hypothesis that Caleb the Atheist has in mind here, that God raised Jesus from the dead bodily for a given purpose, undisclosed purpose, that has nothing to do with authenticating Christianity or even authenticating the Bible. Because when we're saying authenticating Christianity, we just mean Christianity proper. It might be possible, theologically speaking, for a Christian to believe that some resurrection appearances themselves are errors or something, and because they don't believe in biblical inerrancy or something like that, but they still believe in the essential belief that Jesus rose from the dead. What about responding to a progressive Christian or a liberal type Christian or a Christian who takes that type of view? Again, Caleb the Atheist needs to prove, and there he might adopt some Christian argumentation to prove, no, it's got to be an all or nothing on the resurrection appearances. All of those resurrection appearances are essential to being saved. If you believe in the appearance to the 12, but you don't believe in the appearance to the Amos disciples, then you're going to hell. Something like that, I don't know. But the point is, Caleb the Atheist has not demonstrated or met his burden of proof in establishing this link, that all of the resurrection appearances have to be proven to be true or count as evidence for the truth of the resurrection hypothesis, or have to be proven to be true in order to establish the truth of the resurrection hypothesis as we're defining it in this series. There's more work to be done there. So that's my point. I'm going to shut up and let's move on to Paul. All right, so I want to move on to the Apostle Paul, the appearance of the Apostle Paul specifically. And again, note there's a slight difference between me and Caleb's approach. Caleb here, I think, is kind of treating Paul here not as a historical fact and trying to explain that, but he's looking at, well, let's look at our sources in chronological order. Our first chronological source are the letters of Paul as to the appearances in general. So he's talking about all the appearances, then he moves on to the Gospels and stuff like that. So his kind of method is looking in chronological order, the sources and what they give us about the appearances and trying to prove, raise factors that, to Caleb the Atheist's mind, suggest that the resurrection hypothesis is probably false. And that's something I just realized in all of these shows, I've been messing up a little bit because I've been kind of looking at it from the positive end and saying, well, the hypothesis is God did raise Jesus from the dead. And obviously Caleb the atheist, well, he could be trying to falsify that and say, no, that's an improbable hypothesis. Or you could look at it, it's the exact same thing. You could say, well, no, the atheist has his own hypothesis here. Forget about the Christian, they're not making a claim at all, but it's just this atheist, he has his own hypothesis that God did not raise Jesus from the dead or something like that. And all these factors are supposedly to prove that his hypothesis is true. Again, either way, it's not going to make a huge difference, but I just wanted to clarify that because one of my listeners, Brian with an I, if you're listening to this, hello. But yeah, he made an insightful comment about, well, what is the hypothesis again? Isn't Caleb the atheist, isn't he trying to disprove the resurrection? So technically his hypothesis should be God did not raise Jesus from the dead. And yeah, technically speaking, he's right. But it could also, again, in Bayesian logic, right? Anything 49 to 0% is that secondary hypothesis. It's like you're saying, I hypothesize God did not raise Jesus from the dead, or that it's probably false that God did raise Jesus from the dead. So it all is more or less the same thing in Bayes. So I just wanted to note that quickly. Yeah, great. So the Apostle Paul. So I'm going to treat this as a historical fact. I'm going to ignore some of the stuff that he says about other appearances. We're going to focus in on the appearance to the Apostle Paul as an individual fact and explaining that and looking at that aspect. So let's just have a quick glimpse of what Caleb says about that again. Here we go.
All right, let's look at the appearances of Jesus now. So Paul is our earliest witness on this. If we look at 1 Corinthians 15, and although Paul does not go into descriptions of the appearances, he says who saw Jesus. He lists the appearances. That's about it. He doesn't say what they were like. He does drop a few hints that imply that these could be somewhat visionary in those aspects. So Paul talks elsewhere about Christians having visions, whether in the body or the mind, he doesn't know, when he goes up to heaven. So Paul was frequently having these experiences. Paul says that Jesus is inside of him. He revealed his son in me, that he continues to live in his heart. And Acts 26 explicitly says that this was a vision on the road to Damascus, and Acts describes this as a light that Paul saw and became blind to. So all these little hints imply that what Paul saw may have been some kind of heavenly vision, which we would attribute to hallucinations. And there have been some psychologists who argue that Paul could potentially have had epilepsy. We can't prove or disprove that, but it's not completely unthinkable given that. And so since Paul equates his appearance with the resurrection appearances of the other 12, and that's the earliest account we have, it's not improbable to think that these could have been of the same nature, that when Paul says, I saw Jesus and so did Peter and the 12, that all of them had this heavenly experience of Jesus, and that only later on was this fleshed out, pun intended, in the Gospels. Now, as far as why would Paul have a hallucination? Was he a skeptic? Well, that's true, but there are cases of people converting for strange reasons, although it is fairly rare. Again, it's not unthinkable. And I got this screenshot from James Fedor's website, if you want to go check that out, on his article on the resurrection. And he gives a list here of hostile people who were very much against a particular religion who ended up converting for a variety of reasons. And so people like Gerd Ludemann have suggested that Paul may have had a guilt complex. Perhaps Paul felt guilty about the stoning of Stephen or persecuting Christians, and that's what opened him up to have these experiences. Again, we can't prove or disprove that because we have so little information about this historically, but it's not improbable, and we do have other examples of this, so it's not hard to draw analogies here. All right.
Okay, so that's it for Caleb's case. There's several things here that I find problematic or want to address. Okay, so let's start with this, right? So here's this claim that Paul's appearance seems to be, so first of all, he's absolutely right. In the 1 Corinthians chapter 15 creed, which is an early Christian creed recorded in the Pauline book of 1 Corinthians, the Pauline epistle, it's the earliest reference to the resurrection. It goes back within months to a few years after the resurrection event itself. And this is what atheists and skeptical biblical scholars like Dr. Bart Ehrman say. This is from some fairly conclusive proof for the resurrection claims, going back really, really early, within a few months to maybe a couple of years after the fact, after 30 AD. And he's Caleb's right. Yeah, we don't get a lot of details here. We just get the list of the appearances, and it's a comprehensive list. We get to the 12, to Pete, to Peter, to the Apostle Paul, to James, to the 500, and to all the apostles. So and there's also a mention of the empty tomb where it's strongly implied that there's an empty tomb. So a nice little summary of all the evidential factors, but there isn't a lot of details. It is just the list saying he appeared. Well, what the heck does that mean? Now, I think that there's absolute proof beyond all reasonable doubt that this is referring to a bodily resurrection, not a vision. These appearances support the traditional Christian belief. And again, it goes outside that's taking Paul's other letters, the Gospels, everything in the New Testament literature. But just from Paul's other letters, we can prove this much. So I'm shocked to hear Caleb the Atheist kind of say, well, actually, Paul kind of hints that it's an internal experience, it's a vision of some sort. This surprises me, even from Caleb the Atheist. I get that this is a common atheist claim from atheists and skeptics like Carrier or Bob Price or people like that. And I get that they have some Bible references that Caleb mentions here, but these do not at all prove that the appearance to Paul. No, Paul is explicit in saying this was a bodily resurrection. He literally appeared to me. So a couple things to note here. So number one is he uses Acts of the Apostles to try and prove that this was a theophany or a conversion experience and that sort of thing, and therefore an internal vision on Paul's part. So a couple things here. So why, Caleb the Atheist, are you using Acts, right? To prove your case? That's being hypocritical. You can't assume Christianity is true or that biblical inerrancy is true. As a historian, a secular atheistic historian, you have to prove, and you haven't done so here, other than just taking advantage of what the Christians are going to accept Acts. So you're helping yourself to those details. You can't do that. You have to prove historically that those details should be privileged over and against Paul's letters themselves, which don't say it was a vision, which say it was a real bodily appearance, the same as all the other apostles had. And we know from the Gospels, those were bodily appearances and that sort of thing. So a little bit more work here, right? Yet there's a bit of hypocrisy here where the atheist or the skeptic wants to help himself without doing the historical groundwork. His history says you should privilege Paul. He's decades earlier than Acts of the Apostles was written. So we should privilege that over the earlier writing and the eyewitness. Paul was the eyewitness himself to his own appearance, right? That's privileged over and against the historical evidence from Acts. Even if Acts was written by a companion of Paul, it's obvious that Luke is theophanizing his writing, and he's writing details that contradict. He gave 3 accounts that slightly contradict if you read them hyper-literalistically. And obviously that's okay in those standards and stuff like that. I'm not going to defend Luke. He's not actually contradicting in a strict sense or whatever, but it's within the genre that he was writing, ancient historiography. He had latitude, and he was expected to vary secondary details and stuff like that. But yeah, so number one, you should be privileging what Paul says over a later writing from Acts, where we know that he's taking certain liberties within his ancient genre to describe the appearances. So why do we just assume, yeah, it was just a light, it was just that? But then by the same token, atheists and skeptics are hypocrites. And Caleb the Atheist here is not taking advantage of, well, okay, if you're just going to believe Acts, that was his appearance, it was a blinding light, stuff like that, why aren't you just believing the proof, the other authenticating factors in there, like the fact that prove it wasn't a vision, such as other people seeing the light or hearing something, other people being affected by this appearance of Jesus to Paul so that they fall down on the ground. You can't just pick and choose whatever details help you out arbitrarily. And that's what I think Caleb the Atheist is doing here. And Caleb, kudos to you. You're doing a great job, because this is the kind of inconsistent way that atheists, internet atheists at the very least, like to argue all the time. And even atheistic scholars, which is a shame, are they pick and choose which elements they want to work with. And you can't do that. Or if you do that, you have to provide the evidence and reasons as to why this bit is probably historical versus this bit is not. Why is the light probably historical to Paul's appearance, whereas the other people being affected by it, or his subsequent blindness, which count as objective authenticating factors of this being an appearance and not a mere subjective vision, why are those not historical or not a part of the evidence? So that's the first thing I just wanted to mention here is, yeah, Caleb the Atheist, you can do this, but you have to do the work of proving why certain elements in Acts are privileged over Paul, over what the eyewitness Paul himself says. Secondly, why are we taking some bits of Acts that help the vision hypothesis and ignoring other bits that would rule out or suggest the objectivity of an appearance, bodily resurrection appearance, as opposed to a mere vision? So that's what I would say there. The other thing I want to mention to Caleb the Atheist here, and it's kind of stunning to me. So I'm pretty sure that Caleb, the Christian, the real Christian, he understands that this is complete rubbish, but he suggests that, well, Paul says his experience was like everybody else's, and because those were visionary, they're just mere vision. So all the appearances were probably just visions. Now, I want to make and he gives examples, like an example where Paul might have had a near-death experience type thing, and he went up to heaven, the third heaven or something, and he didn't know whether he was in the body or not. This was clearly a vision. Or Stephen, he clearly had a vision of Jesus. This was not an objective appearance right before he was martyred and stuff like this. Well, unfortunately, though, it's fairly wide biblical scholarship, recognized among virtually all biblical scholars, that actually the early Christians did not equate visions with appearances. The appearances were a key requirement to become an apostle of Christ, right? You had to follow Jesus during his ministry. You had to witness his death and resurrection. You had to have that resurrection appearance, not a vision. Lots of Christians in the early church had visions. The Corinthians had visions. They were not apostles. They were not qualified to be apostles. They distinguished between appearances of Christ, which were finite only to a certain group of people and then stopped for all time, versus ongoing visions, which any and all Christians could be subject to. So let me just bring this up.
Descriptions of the appearances, he says.
So yeah, if you look at, so in the first place, let's actually look at Acts 26. And I'm surprised it doesn't say anything about it being in a vision explicitly at all. It talks about a light and stuff, but let's hear what Acts 26 says, because this just isn't true, what Caleb the Atheist said.
Nazareth. This I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests. And when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. And I punished them often in every synagogue and compelled them to blaspheme. Being exceedingly enraged against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. While thus occupied, as I journeyed to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priests, at midday, O king, along the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me and those who journeyed with me. And when we all had fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So I said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a
minister and a witness both of the things which you have seen and of the things which I will yet reveal to you. I will deliver you from the Jewish people.
All right, so you get this point. I don't see anywhere where it explicitly says this is just the vision. Instead, it says, I appeared to you so that you would be a witness. These are key buzzwords in the ancient early Christian church during the first decades or so. When to be a witness, you had to meet those strict apostolic requirements of being an eyewitness to a resurrection appearance of Christ, not just a vision, but an appearance. And there was a clear distinction there. And I'll prove that in a moment. But yeah, I don't see anything. Yes, there was a light, and yes, this story involves certain theophany or theophany type language type deal, but that doesn't prove it's a vision at all. I mean, Moses adopts the burning of the bush adopts theophany type language. It was still literal according to the Bible and stuff like that. So yeah, I think the Caleb the Atheist is being a little bit too assumptive at this part, and he's withholding from you. Again, I would expect a little bit better, because even Caleb, this is advice for you, the real Caleb kind of thing. If you want to make the best case for the atheist, I know that you already know this, right? So let's take a look at Belief Map. This is a great website. I'll include it in the sources, but this has great information by Blake Giunta here. But yeah, does Paul differentiate the appearances from later visions and feelings? And yes, he does. We have absolute proof. Christians differentiated appearances from visions. So this was just, in the first place, there's general evidence. Ancients did this by default. We have examples from Paul, Peter, and the church differentiating these. The church says, look, the appearances stopped after 30 AD. Not a single one took place, but we have absolute proof that visions continued after that. And then later, Paul assumed that everyone knew that appearances had stopped in his writings, and he gives various proofs of that. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 1 implies an enduring effect of this appearance, meaning that it was once and for all, it was done, and now that he is seen, past tense, even though he's present tense having visions still, he's seen the Lord only that one time, and that had an enduring effect to qualify him as an apostle of Christ and for his mission. Paul never includes his appearance or conversion appearance in his vision boasting when he boasts about the visions he has from Christ. Yeah, so you can see, obviously, I'm sure Caleb the Christian is going to mention in his 4 case that actually the early Christians differentiate between appearances and just mere subjective visions. So yeah, this is just total, what Caleb the Atheist says here is just wrong. I get that there are atheists, even atheist scholars, who try to argue this way, or skeptical biblical scholars who try to twist and contort the certain scriptures and take verses out of context, such as the ones a couple of the ones he mentions here. But it's just clear overall that definitely they're wrong and Christians are right. They did differentiate in this way. So I'm just gonna leave it at that, and hopefully Caleb will get into the more details establishing that in the 4 video. But yeah, I just find it interesting that in order for atheists to make their best case, they have to ignore certain details. They can't give you all the facts. They just have to give you bits and pieces, and then to try to trick you and then extrapolate from that. Whereas the Christian side, we're better. We take into account all the facts, and bada boom, bada bing, there are explanations for the quote unquote problematic verses. We don't hide from them or hide it when making our case for the resurrection. And overall, it's clear that Christians are correct in their interpretations and that sort of thing overall. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. Another thing that Caleb says in this part is about mechanisms and stuff like that. So I'm gonna talk about this in a second. But so basically, Caleb the Atheist mentions that 2 things that I'm going to take issue with. So he mentions, well, some scholars, and this is true, Garrett Ludeman and others, have tried to hint at psychological type mechanisms or hallucination inducing type psychological mechanisms that account naturalistically for Paul's appearance. And one of the things they'll say is they'll try to appeal to, well, there's certain problems with Paul. He had doubts, or had suffered from cognitive dissonance, and he was semi or subconsciously sympathetic to the Christians and everything like that. I totally disagree with that. In the first place, these mechanisms, I'll address this in a little bit, in a bit. These mechanisms have been ruled out and they're contrary to the evidence. So Caleb the Atheist is wrong in saying we can't, yes, we can't prove it, but it's an equally probable explanation that maybe Paul was having some psychological feelings towards Christianity, and he was a secret sympathizer deep down, possibly even deluding himself, and this is why he's acting out and trying to kill people. This directly contradicts what Paul himself says about his own experience. We get, so in Galatians or in Acts, we get autobiographical statements and biographical statements where Paul, he's gung-ho, he's fully committed, he's zealous for the traditions of his ancestors. He's right, they're wrong, I'm happy to be doing this. There's no indications of doubts or cognitive dissonance or anything like what along the lines that Caleb the Atheist is saying here. And I believe that we can rule out these types of psychological explanations on that basis. Now, yes, it is scant data. It's only in a few places. But again, this is Paul the eyewitness describing himself. He knows his own internal states, and all the evidence suggests the opposite. So I think it's proven on a balance of probabilities. It's not proven beyond reasonable doubt by any means. It's not like, oh, a very strong case, but it's definitely 60 to 65% convinced, I would say, minimally, maybe even up to 70%. I would say I'm convinced that Paul was truly zealous. He didn't experience any doubts or problems. The Christians were fakes, kill them. I'm standing up for what's right and what's good. I don't believe you that he had secret or even subconscious doubts. Paul doesn't evidence any of these signs associated with making that kind of psycho analysis on him. In fact, it's the opposite. He contradicts what psychologists say would be evident symptoms. And again, part of that is obviously due to the fact, well, we just have scant data of Paul. It's not fair to make a psychoanalysis. But of the bits that we have, they're all contradictory with what medical and psychological science says we should expect in these cases. So we can rule it out on a balance of probabilities. It is improbable. It's not an equally probable explanation. It is improbable given the data we have. And I rely on Galatians, but not only that, I'll also look at N.T. Wright's analysis of the 1 Corinthians Creed. What does it mean Paul was untimely born? I think the best, more probable explanation of this is he was yoinked out. There was no precursors of doubts in his mind and kind of, I kind of like these Christians. Yeah, I dig what they're saying here, but no, I've got to be, protect my ancestors, so I'm going to kill them and stuff. There's none of that in the actual evidence we have. So yeah, I think that N.T. Wright's explanation in his book, Resurrection of the Son of God, talking about what Paul means by being untimely born, in combination with the biographical and autobiographical statements talking about Paul just being gung-ho, zealous, and totally committed to the Jewish ways and against the Christians. I think that's proof on a balance of probabilities. And yeah, I think we can rule out these psychological explanations. Another thing Caleb mentions here, the last thing, and again, it's a mechanistic point. So he mentions various explanations, and he says some have argued that Paul might have had epilepsy. So that's true. Of course, atheists and skeptics have cooked up anything and everything under the sun to try to avoid the obvious truth. Sorry, I'm getting polemical again. They've cooked up various explanations over the centuries. So there have been psychological explanations. Believe it or not, these have been refuted for the most part. A lot of world's experts and scholars are now shying away from these. These are not popular anymore, but there's environmental type explanations. Kind of the most popular ones are social scientific type explanations and that sort of thing. But yeah, Paul, once again, let me just bring that up. Here's a quote from one of the world's experts in this area, quote, "In response to a more neurological approach based on epilepsy, Paul's visions do not resemble those experienced in epileptic seizures, contrary to a view once held often in biblical scholarship." And other people mention that psychomotor epilepsy does not have the same neurological features as does trance-like states, although it does as trance-like states. So there's the quote there. So this epilepsy thing has kind of been ruled out or discredited as improbable. It's not an equally probable explanation. In fact, the more trend is nowadays going more for social scientific type explanations. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify that based on what he said. So yeah, let me do this. What I want to do at this point is explain my approach before I go to his second slide on Paul. So when I was studying the individual in explanatory isolation, the appearance of the Apostle Paul, I believe he was definitely a fully committed skeptic. He had no unconscious or pathological defects of any sort. I think that that's plausible, but that's improbable. So yeah, therefore I didn't rely on those types of explanations. I think those have been falsified on a balance of probabilities. So that I only looked at certain types of explanations. When I tried to study the Apostle Paul, hopefully this is showing up, I came up with 4 arguments to try and prove that the appearance to the Apostle Paul, specifically as a committed, happy skeptic of Christianity, is supernatural or was a religious authenticating event. Couldn't be explained through ordinary naturalistic mechanisms. And obviously the first thing that we just kind of talked about with epilepsy is the straightforward mechanistic type argument, right? So this is an argument that Caleb Jackson says, oh, well, it's impossible for a skeptic to experience hallucination because the skeptics, they wouldn't be in the mindset. You have to have this element of expectation to induce a hallucination. It also has to be, as a subjective vision or hallucination, it has to be fully within the content of your mind. And some people have tried to say, well, maybe it would be outside of Paul's mind to even consider Jesus as the crucified Messiah or as the Jewish Messiah after he'd been crucified and stuff like that. So there's been arguments like that. I think that these fail. I agree with Caleb the Atheist that there are, even though I disagree with the mechanisms he suggests, I think those have been proven to be improbable in modern scholarship. I do still think that there are environmental type aspects that can induce an individual hallucination. Obviously, the content was in Paul's mind, right? And this is going to differentiate him when we get to the second line of argumentation, the uniqueness aspect. But essentially, there are mechanisms. So some people can have sunstroke, and this induces hallucinations. That's environmental. Remember, Paul tells us it was about midday, and he was trekking really, really far, really, really fast in a hurry to kill those crazy Christians and stuff like that in the middle of a Judean desert. This makes perfect sense. I think this is an equally probable explanation, or perhaps a midbrain stroke is an equally plausible explanation. Those are the ordinary naturalistic explanations or mechanisms that I think, yeah, we can't rule that out. We can't prove those are improbable, and therefore say that the Apostle Paul probably had a supernatural real appearance of the resurrected Christ. So the direct mechanistic argument is a failure in my mind. But again, you have to appeal to different mechanisms. I don't think appealing to mechanisms that either have to rely upon faulty premises, like things that go against positing Paul's mental state being fragile or somehow disposed towards Christianity, either consciously or subconsciously in some way, those don't work. That contradicts the evidence, and they're improbable as a result. I don't think that that's true to how Paul's internal mind was or his attitude towards Christianity. I take what he says at face value. I think that's probably correct. He was totally gung-ho. So this was an abrupt 180-degree thing. I also don't take things that are pathological or neurological type mechanisms that posit he had some kind of neurological defect. Yes, those are plausible, but again, that just contradicts the evidence that we have. There's no evidence in favor of that. And it just doesn't seem to fit what we know of Paul and his experience otherwise, even taking into account his subsequent visions and stuff like that. Again, maybe those were all real. So yeah, I would more go for an environmental type explanation. I think those are the best. Something in the environment, like the hot sun at midday, and the fact that Paul's exerting himself and he's obsessed with killing these wretched Christians who are corrupting his beloved traditions of his ancestors, and he's so zealous for them. This is on his mind. He knows what they teach. He knows the content. Oh, Jesus is supposedly the resurrected Messiah and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, the heat gets to him, or he has this mid-brain stroke. Jesus appears to him, and he believes it's literally an appearance of the bodily risen Jesus. And oh, I was wrong. Okay, I'm committed the other way. That's what I think has happened. So yeah, this is a failure as an argument. The next mechanistic type argument is, okay, well, maybe we can't prove that all ordinary naturalistic mechanisms are improbable relative to Paul having a real resurrection appearance or a supernatural appearance or something like that. Can we argue, though, that it is at least unique despite a sufficient opportunity for duplication? And this is where, remember, Caleb, in his second slide on the Apostle Paul, links to James Fedor, and he gives all of these supposed peeps who would prove that no, Paul is not unique. Yes, he was a committed skeptic, but there are also committed skeptics who have done a 180 about turn after some kind of experience, and this converted them. Okay, so I've looked into these guys. Some of them I already know, right? So the problem with this list, I would say, for Caleb the Atheist is all this is doing is this is kind of lazy. All it is just conversion stories. These are not necessarily analogous to what Paul went through. And I was trying my best to find one that was. This is probably the closest, but even he fails. He's disanalogous. So again, it's unique despite sufficient opportunity. Well, yep, there's been a sufficient opportunity. There's naturalistic opportunity. There's been lots and lots of people who've converted their religions over the centuries and millennia. Surely at least one of them would be known who is exactly comparable to Paul in the relevant ways. Unfortunately, in this list, none of them are really. So let's take Julian the Apostate, a Christian educated Roman emperor. Sure, he was Christian educated. He was never a Christian. You just don't know the history then of Julian the Apostate. He didn't revert. He was never anything other than a pagan. He always hated Christianity. He went through the motions and faked it because he had to. But yeah, he was never convinced by it. He was always a committed pagan from the time he was old enough to understand and that sort of thing. So this is not a conversion in any real sense of the word that's comparable to the committed Paul, zealous for the traditions of his ancestors, then one day abruptly out of nowhere, just, oh, okay, Christianity's true. Certainly Julian the Apostate had political pressures and motivations as are here. So yeah, and this was a gradual change. It took time for Julian to take his time because he didn't want to peeve off the powerful Christians in his midst and stuff like that. This is not comparable to Paul at all. Ahsoka the Great, the conversion to Buddhism from there, that's not comparable at all. That's more, yeah, he conquered and he was open-minded and stuff, and he became convinced by Buddhism and stuff through the arguments. Nothing like Paul. Paul could only have been convinced through a supernatural appearance, a sudden event happen and went, oh, I'm wrong 180 degrees abruptly. So yeah, why did the Christian philosopher, I looked into Michael Saduth, why did he convert to Hinduism? This is, again, nothing like the Apostle Paul. This guy psychologically admits, when you read his thing, that he was open to Hinduism. He was starting to like it. It was a process. He was reading more and more into it and got seduced into the Eastern religions and stuff like that. That's nothing like Paul's abrupt conversion. He wasn't open to considering Christianity. They were the bad guys in his mind until God powerfully gave him supernatural proof. Then all of a sudden, oh, I was wrong. Okay, now he believes. So the closest one is this guy, because he was an Islamic filmmaker. Now he's a committed Muslim. And again, I'll provide the link, his links right here, but I'll give the link in my blog as well. So yeah, this guy, from what he said in his brief thing, it seems like to me, yep, he was anti-Islam. He maybe even did violence and stuff, was open to violence and hated Muslims and stuff like that. And now he converted to Islam. But is this comparable to Paul? No, not at all, because basically he was ignorant of Muslims. He hated the Muslims for false reasons. And then when he started, okay, I'm going to read the Quran, actually read it, and go to a mosque. And he was delighted that he was welcomed and they loved him and showed him all this kindness and stuff. Oh, wow. It's kind of like the typical leftist notion today in this world where they think everyone's an idiot. And if you just meet a gay person, then you'll know that I've met gay people. They're nice people. I like them. I can be friends with them. And a lot of them are and stuff like that. That isn't the problem. Ignorance isn't the problem. And ignorance wasn't the problem with Paul, even though ignorance was the problem with this Arnoud Van Dorn guy. It was because of ignorance that he hated. And then once he met Muslims and actually read the Quran for himself, he realized, oh, this isn't what I was taught. Therefore, the basis for my hatred is done. And he started developing respect. That's nothing like with Paul. Paul knew what the Christians claimed. He hated them because he had knowledge of what they claimed. It was based on what he knew that caused him to be anti-Christian at that time. And only a supernatural resurrection appearance of Christ could wake him and jolt him out of that and say, you're wrong. You're persecuting me, God. Stop it. Stop kicking at the goads and stuff like that. So yeah, this isn't really analogous either. So yeah, that said, so I think that this uniqueness, mechanistic argument from the uniqueness of Paul's experience, despite sufficient opportunity, I have never seen a real account, a claimed account that says this is a duplicate of Paul. He was truly a skeptic. He had all of the relevant circumstances were comparable to what Paul went through, and abruptly they converted to a new religion because of some experience or something. Now, I don't treat this as a successful argument. I treated this as a questionable or perhaps a failure on the basis of testimony, trusting Christians. I trusted Gary Habermas, and I also reached out to Nabil Qureshi. And they said, yeah, sure, that there are tales of Muslims, for example, who were anti-Islam. They had an appearance or vision, some kind of supernatural experience, and they abruptly converted to Islam. I just trusted them. And maybe that's a mistake. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe this argument is successful, this uniqueness despite sufficient opportunity for duplication. In this case, there's plenty of naturalistic opportunity. I never asked for specific examples to look into. I just kind of trusted and said, okay, fine. This hurts the case for the Christian, so I'm just going to assume you're right, that there are comparable cases, analogous cases to Paul out there. Maybe I was too hasty there. Maybe I'm wrong, because if this is the best list, James Fedora is way smarter than me. He's a very smart atheist and skeptic. If this is the best list he could come up with, maybe I was too hasty and just assuming Nabil Qureshi and Gary Habermas are right. Maybe there aren't comparable cases when you actually look into the details. In that case, this would be a success. Paul's experience would be unique once you factor in the actual relevant circumstances. So this has kind of got me thinking. I always just assumed in favor of atheists and skeptics on this uniqueness issue, but yeah, seeing that this is the best James Fedor could do, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe there's something to it after all. I need to give that a rethink. All right, cool. So what was my third way of arguing, right? Because I said this was a failure. The third way of arguing is through authenticating factors. So this is something I hinted at before, right? So after Paul's, he went blind. That's something that requires an additional explanation and makes atheists and skeptics very ad hoc in trying to explain that, if that's a historical. Obviously, you have to debate, well, is that a historical fact? Are these authenticating factors historical? And that's where the controversy comes in. Like, is it true that Paul went blind? If you do, can a midday stroke hallucination really, mid-brain stroke or a sunstroke induced hallucination account for your subsequent blindness? No, it can't. You require additional explanations. There are some psychological explanations that are pathological in nature. And again, those have been ruled out as improbable if you look into the details in terms of explaining Paul specifically, but there are some mechanisms out there that can create hallucinations and then result in subsequent blindness. I think it's conversion disorder. I'm not just going off the top of my head, but there are mechanisms that might do that. So okay, great, we can account for that authenticating factor afterwards. But then what about other authenticating factors? What if we can prove that this was an objective experience because Paul's companions heard and or saw something at the exact same time Paul was having this appearance? Sure, they didn't get all the information. Acts is clear that they didn't see or hear everything Paul did, but they heard and saw something that forced them to the ground or convinced them, oh my goodness, something's going on here that's not just normal naturalistic mechanisms. So yeah, if you can prove that, if his companions saw the light, this miraculous light as well, that would serve to show this wasn't just a hallucination on Paul's part. This would rule out mechanisms like that. It would have to be some kind of objective experience, and then that objective thing just happened to coincide with within a hallucination inside Paul, and then you're becoming ad hoc. So yeah, this is something that, again, I just said 50-50. Again, the main point here is going to be, what are the authenticating factors that we can historically prove happen versus not? And that's where you're getting into more controversial territory. Do we accept the secondary details of Acts as being historical? Well, how come there's contradictions between the accounts? Did his companions fall down or stand up or something like that? There's problems there in taking it literally as and saying that we can prove these additional elements are in fact historical. So yeah, I think it's a little bit harder if you're going to use this argument. And that's why I didn't in my own conversion. But again, it's all about the debate. Yeah, if you can prove certain secondary elements happened that would rule out or make improbable that Paul just had a sunstroke-induced hallucination, great, then this works. Yeah, it all just depends on the arguing out whether it's a historical fact, these are historical facts or not, in terms of these authenticating factors, as I call them. The final argument, this is the one I worked on with Dr. David Instone Brewer a lot, and I thought it was going to be successful. In the end, I thought it just failed. But look, no matter how mechanistically you explain Paul, the fact is, this is what I call the anti-Torah argument. And Jesus is a crucified Messiah. Paul is totally zealous for the traditions. He has this entrenched, non-negotiable Jewish belief that no matter what miracles you witness or supernatural events you witness, again, forget about the mechanism. Paul thought it was a supernatural thing. That much is clear. It was a supernatural appearance to Paul's mind, and that's all that matters to this argument. What he saw was anti-Torah. He would never believe it, no matter what. This is what I was trying to argue. He could not, a crucified Messiah, he could not accept that no matter what he saw. remember, I think it's Paul himself who tells us, who cares if an angel himself or Satan himself does miracles in front of you? He contradicts the Bible, the Torah, or what God has said in his revealed world. You don't care. So, I mean, just because he witnessed a supernatural event, that wouldn't be enough to convince him to violate and turn his back on the Torah, given he's totally zealous and committed to it. And I'm saying, yes, we can establish that based on the evidence. So I disagree with Caleb the atheist there. I don't think it's equally probable in terms of Paul's mind state. I think he was probably zealous. It's not proven beyond reasonable doubt, but it's definitely proven on a balance of probabilities. So given that's the case, then this anti-Torah thing would happen. He wouldn't be impressed by just mere supernatural events when it's contradicting his Torah beliefs, the God's word. And like I said, he continued to have this attitude even after he became a Christian, right? I don't care if somebody claims to be the Messiah or if he's an angel himself doing miracles. He tells you to contradict scripture, you tell him to go to heck. You tell him to go jump in a lake or something like that. So yeah, obviously that would mean it would require further authenticating factors. The only thing I think of could be like a properly basic belief that the message attached to this supernatural appearance is, in fact, this is true. The message, I am God. Jesus is God. I am the Messiah. You were wrong. And that would prompt him to be, to convert, abruptly convert and see him, oh, now, okay, now I get it. And then he works out after the fact, now I get it. Yeah, because you rose, you're not a crucified Messiah technically. So there is no shame. And he works out the details after the fact, but in terms of his abrupt conversion, there would have to be something attached to the appearance itself, even if he thought it was a supernatural appearance, that prompted him and pushed him to convert when it's going against scripture. It's not alone to just have the supernatural experience itself. That wouldn't be enough to convince him, because he just, oh, you're just a demon, you're just a devil. I don't care what you say. I follow God's word. Go ahead and do little magic tricks. It doesn't convince me. So that was the argument that I tried, and I was working on with people like Gary Habermas, Dr. David and Stone Brewer, and a bunch of people. But in the end, I didn't know that we could prove that the supernatural experience alone wouldn't prompt Paul to lead Paul naturalistically to make these connections and stuff like that in the Bible, and kind of say, okay, well, yeah, you can be a crucified Messiah if you really rose, and because I saw you, yeah, you really did raise. So that's why in the end I said this was a failure. Why in the end I don't think that there is any way to prove on a balance of probabilities based on Paul's appearance individually in explanatory isolation that, yeah, Jesus probably rose from the dead. God raised Jesus from the dead, or that this is probably a religious authenticating event. No, it seems to me that there are equally probable ordinary naturalistic explanations that can account for all four of these aspects. But yeah, there are at least a few areas open, but that's how I kind of assessed it. Maybe I'm wrong in my assessment. Maybe there is something to Paul's appearance individually, and maybe I was wrong when I assessed this in back in the day. It's worth a relook, reevaluating all four of these factors now and seeing, do I still agree with my assessment back then? So yeah, with that said, I think that's it in terms of Paul. Let's move on to some of the other appearances and what he says there.
Okay, one thing actually, just before we move on with Caleb's video, one thing I should mention that's related here is the individual appearance to James, the brother of Jesus. One of the leaders in the early church, was the biological brother of Jesus Christ himself, a son of Mary and Joseph. And he's claimed, Christian apologists will sometimes claim he was also a skeptic. So it's not just an appearance to one skeptic, Paul, but we also have James, the brother of the Lord, who is a skeptic as well. So this is double proof. One thing I just want to say, so I see a difference between Paul and James. With Paul, I do think we can prove on a balanced probabilities that he was indeed a skeptic with no doubts, no subconscious leanings towards Christianity at all. However, I don't think we can prove that's a historical fact, that James, the brother of Jesus, was a skeptic historically on a balance of probabilities in the same way we can with Paul. So there's a difference there, actually. Now, I agree with Christians, apologists like Dr. Gary Habermas, and that we can prove James was indeed a skeptic of Jesus during his ministry. And possibly, I think it also works even up to the time of his crucifixion. James was an unbeliever. He was a skeptic. He didn't really believe his brother. After he died, and perhaps even heard claims of that he had risen from the dead, I think this impacted him, and he was ambivalent, perhaps, after the time of his resurrection. And he wasn't a true, I don't think we can prove he was a skeptical unbeliever of Jesus. I think it's more likely he was probably an ambiguous, or he wasn't sure what to make of his brother at the time of his resurrection appearance. So even if he was a skeptic, proven skeptic at certain times in Jesus' ministry, and possibly a proven skeptic, because why wasn't he with his mom at the foot of the cross looking after his brother? Well, some people say that. Apologists and biblical scholars argue that's because he was a skeptic. He didn't believe in his brother. He thought his brother was nuts and didn't want anything to do with him. So that's why he wasn't there at the cross. And Jesus says, "Behold your son," talking about John, the beloved disciple there. "This is your son, this is your mom." James, he should have been here. He let me down, the heck with him, so to speak, right? Because obviously it was really important, the next eldest son, after the oldest son, Jesus, had died, taking care of the family unit and the mom and stuff like that. So I can buy all of that. I can get on board with those arguments, but that still doesn't prove, even if James was a skeptic, a hardcore skeptic of Jesus at the time of the crucifixion, that doesn't prove he was a skeptic at the time of his resurrection appearance, especially if he was, an empty tomb, and he's hearing reports of resurrection appearances. This would cause him to say, maybe, plus the emotional grief, even if he's still his brother, for crying out loud, a biological half-brother. He would have felt some type of way about his brother dying, even if he did think he was a fake or something like that. So that combined, I do think, could induce a grief or type hallucination. There's an ordinary naturalistic explanation readily available for James. Plus, we can't prove that he was a hardcore skeptic in the same way we can with Paul. The second major difference between Paul and James is that Paul is relatively independent of the other historical facts. When you're analyzing the appearance to Paul as an individual in explanatory isolation, it's easily separated from the other facts. Yes, that the other facts are relevant because that informed what the Christian church was teaching, and that seeped into Paul's head, the teaching Jesus was the crucified and risen Messiah and stuff like that. And he probably would have known, they're claiming to have appearances in an empty tomb. And he would have been aware of those facts, but those didn't directly impact on his state of mind. If anything, the impacts they had would mitigate against a naturalistic interpretation, as we tried to argue, right? Because that made him more zealous against them and that sort of thing. With James, he's only semi-independent, I would say, as an ambivalent unbeliever at the time of his resurrection appearance. And even if he was a hardcore skeptic, he would still be impacted, and his appearance happened not years after the fact like Paul's, but probably within the short time span and stuff like that. So he would have but anyways, with James, he would have been associated with the Galilean apostles, his mom and stuff like that, and would have heard stuff from them and been impacted by them. So I would say he's semi-independent, factually speaking, right? There could be certain historical facts or like other appearances and stuff that are conducive to his having a grief-stricken hallucination, and or just a hallucination, or whatever it is. It doesn't even have to be a hallucination. Whatever the naturalistic explanation is, he had some kind of appearance, an illusion, a delusion, whatever it is. He had some kind of experience he interpreted to be an appearance of his risen brother Jesus from the dead, and that convinced him to convert and fully commit to the Christian movement and stuff like that, independently of his own, where he saw Jesus or something like that and came to belief. So yeah, there are naturalistic explanations readily available, including ones whereby other facts that we've established are conducive or semi-conducive to the fact that James had an appearance as well. And that's different than the skeptic Paul, where these other facts or these other appearances and stuff like that would not be as conducive to Paul. They couldn't be argued to be conducive to Paul having an appearance of Jesus. He wouldn't care. As a skeptic, I don't believe these guys. I don't care. I'm not influenced mentally by their claims at all. So there's a difference there between James and Paul. I think it's wrong for Christian apologists. I would agree with Caleb the Atheist that there weren't two skeptics, at least two provable skeptics. There was only Paul. James, we can't prove that he was a skeptic at the time of his resurrection appearance, and we can't treat him exactly the same as we do Paul on the explanatory level, because where Paul is relatively independent, his appearance happened years after the fact, and he wasn't mentally impacted in the same way, in a way that would be conducive for his having a hallucination, in the same way that James would have been impacted by the empty tomb, the death of his brother, and the resurrection appearance, the other resurrection appearances being reported to him, and kind of making him go, whoa, I don't know what to think. And he's very emotional. So there's at least even though he wasn't a follower of Jesus up until the time of his crucifixion, obviously, because otherwise he would have been there with his mom, unlike John, the beloved disciple, there's at most semi-independence there, right? There is some kind of connection whereby these things could be conducive to the fact that James ended up having a hallucination or ended up having an appearance of Jesus or something naturalistically explainable, right? So yeah, there's that difference approaching it from the atheist perspective, and I don't think the Christian can try to make an argument from, yeah, but we didn't just have one skeptic who had an appearance, we had two skeptics in the simplistic way that it's usually reported to be. So I just wanted to say that. All right, with that said, I think that's it for this one. I believe it or not, I can't get into the rest of his stuff on the appearances because I think this is too long already. So yeah, let me have a look at it. But otherwise, I think I'll continue on in part 3. Maybe this will have to be 4 parts. It looks like I'm taking too long. Maybe I need to learn to be more concise or something. But yeah, for now, I think that's it. So yeah, look out for part 3 next time. We'll continue on reviewing Caleb Jackson's video.